Your grandmother never measured a thing. She cracked an egg into the flour, watched how the dough moved, and knew exactly when it was right. She could stretch one chicken into 3 days of meals, keep bread soft for a week without a plastic bag, and turn burnt rice into something the whole family fought over. These were not recipes you could look up. They were tricks, passed hand to hand across kitchen tables, scribbled in the margins of cookbooks that fell apart decades ago. Some of them sound impossible today. One of these tricks uses nothing but a brown paper bag to fry the crispiest chicken you have ever tasted. Another turns stale bread into a thickener better than anything from a store shelf. And a forgotten method kept butter fresh for months without any refrigerator at all. Burying food underground for natural refrigeration was one of the quiet genius moves that let Native American families survive through blistering summers and brutal winters alike. It sounds almost too simple now, but when done right, it was remarkably effective. By digging deep, shaded pits and lining them with grass, bark, or even cool stones, they created natural refrigerators that could keep vegetables crisp, fruits fresh, and even meat safer than leaving it above ground. There was an art to it, a dance with the seasons and the soil that few today remember. But the wisdom of making the earth itself your storage partner never truly faded. And when long journeys or harsh winters loomed ahead, native chefs had another brilliant solution for keeping their people nourished on the move, mixing wild berries, nuts, and hidden energy into one of history's first real trail mixes. Smoking meat in the backyard shed was one of those timeless practices that kept food safe without refrigeration. Grandfathers built simple smokehouses from wood or stone, using controlled fires to cure meat slowly. The smoke not only preserved the meat, but also gave it a flavor unmatched by fresh cuts. Hams, sausages, and fish hung for days or weeks, soaking in the smoke until they were ready. Families relied on these sheds to store protein for months, making sure nothing spoiled when cold weather set in and hunting or farming slowed. The process took steady effort, since fires had to be tended carefully to give enough smoke without burning the meat. Neighbors often gathered at these sheds, trading advice, swapping wood types, and even sharing a portion of their catch. The smell of hickory or oak smoke drifting from the shed became part of the rhythm of rural life, something as natural as the changing seasons. It symbolized self-reliance and pride in providing for one's family with skill instead of store-bought conveniences. Today, smokehouses are rare and mostly seen as hobbies, but the tradition still stands as a clever example of survival and community bound together by food. Egg salad mold was one of those recipes that perfectly captured the adventurous spirit of 70s cooking. Housewives would combine chopped hard-boiled eggs, mayonnaise, and vegetables, suspend it all in gelatin, and set it in decorative molds. The result was a wobbly, colorful ring that was sliced and served at luncheons or holiday tables. While it might seem unusual today, at the time it felt stylish and impressive, a departure from plain bowls of salad. Gelatin molds were trendy, and turning egg salad into one gave it both structure and spectacle. It was a way to take the familiar and make it exciting without adding extra cost. Guests admired the presentation, while families enjoyed the familiar flavor hidden beneath the shine. For homemakers, it was another trick to prove that creativity could elevate even the humblest of dishes. Stuffed green peppers with rice and tomato sauce were a clever way to make a little beef go a long way. By hollowing out peppers and filling them with a mixture of rice, scraps of ground beef, and tomato sauce, moms created a hearty dish that looked impressive but cost very little. The rice carried most of the bulk, while the beef added flavor and protein, making the meal balanced without being expensive. Tomato sauce tied everything together and added a comforting tang. This dish became popular not only because it was thrifty, but also because it felt satisfying and festive, with each family member served their own portion. It also fit neatly into the casserole culture of the 1960s, where entire meals were baked in one dish and served straight from the oven. Stuffed peppers remain a nostalgic reminder of how clever cooking used simple vegetables to anchor meals that brought comfort and thrift to the table. Homemade ice cream in coffee cans turned dessert into a family game, avoiding the cost of store-bought ice cream machines. Families filled small cans with cream, sugar, and flavorings, sealed them tight, and placed them inside larger cans packed with ice and salt. Children rolled the cans back and forth across the yard until the mixture inside froze into ice cream. It was cheap entertainment, and dessert rolled into one, and everyone remembered the joy of shaking, rattling, and laughing together. Parents loved it because it used only basic ingredients and kept children busy, while the end result was creamy and satisfying. Ice cream companies certainly did not want people realizing they could make gallons of the treat at home with little effort. This trick represented both thrift and fun, proving that even luxury desserts could be created from household items and a little family effort. It was tradition disguised as play. Pot liquor with cornbread was not just a dish, it was a philosophy of frugality passed down in Southern kitchens. Pot liquor was the leftover cooking liquid from boiling greens such as collards, turnips, or mustard, rich with vitamins and nutrients that seeped into the water. Rather than pour it out, poor families saved it and sopped it up with chunks of cornbread, creating a meal that cost almost nothing yet was surprisingly nourishing. It was especially valued during times when meat and dairy were scarce, as it provided iron and other nutrients that kept families strong. Many considered it a delicacy despite its humble origins, and the flavor of smoky greens mixed with soft cornbread became a treasured memory. Pot liquor embodied the idea that nothing should go to waste, and even the water from cooking vegetables could become a meal in its own right. It fed generations through poverty and war, and its legacy still lingers in Southern cooking today. What some might see as scraps, poor families saw as opportunity, and pot liquor with cornbread was one of the most ingenious and life-sustaining dishes ever created out of near nothing. Creamed, canned corn with a flour slurry was one of those dishes that made something ordinary feel just a little indulgent. The idea was to take a can of corn, cheap, shelf-stable, and always on hand, and give it a makeover. You'd pour the corn, liquid and all, into a saucepan and stir in a quick mix of water and flour. As it simmered, the slurry thickened the liquid into a creamy, starchy sauce that hugged every kernel. Some recipes suggested a splash of milk or a dab of margarine if you had it. But even without those, the final result was comforting. It mimicked the texture of creamed corn without needing fresh cream or butter, two things that were either rationed or too expensive for many homes. This little side dish showed up at dinner tables next to meatloaf, fried potatoes, or bean patties, giving the meal a creamy contrast and helping to fill plates without much cost. It's a great example of how far a single can and a spoonful of flour could go. Cookbooks promoted this trick for its thrift, but people remembered it because it worked. Simple, smart, and warm. What more could you ask for? Onion skin dye for Easter eggs was not just a craft, it was a celebration made from scraps. Food coloring was not always available and certainly not affordable. So families turned to what they had: the flaky outer skins from yellow or red onions, saved in a jar next to the stove. Around Easter, those skins were boiled with water and vinegar, sometimes with a bit of cloth wrapped around the eggs to hold the dye in place. The result? Deep, marbled colors, coppers, russets, and warm browns no store-bought dye could match. Children watched the magic happen, waiting for their eggs to emerge like little treasures from the pot. It was slow, fragrant work, and it made the whole house smell earthy and warm. Some people added ferns or leaves under the wrapping to leave a delicate imprint. Others used wax or string to make patterns. What mattered most was the spirit behind it, creating beauty with what little you had. In homes where budgets were tight and luxuries scarce, these dyed eggs were a gift. They meant spring had come, and there was still joy to be had, even when things were hard. That kind of hope boiled into every egg. Cooling cookies fast with a brown paper bag layer was one of those practical, clever tricks Grandma always had up her sleeve, though she probably never called it a trick at all. Fancy wire racks were nice if you had them, but not every kitchen did, especially in homes where money was tight and gadgets were rare. But a brown paper bag from the grocery store? That worked better than most would expect. Grandma would cut it open, lay it flat on the counter, and place warm cookies right on top. The paper absorbed just enough moisture to cool the cookies quickly, while the bottoms crisped up perfectly. No sticking, no soggy spots, no mess to wash after. It was simple, effective, and completely quiet. The kind of trick that came from making do with what you had, turning leftovers and scraps into small victories. You would sneak one off the bag, still warm, still crisp, and never think twice about the paper beneath. But Grandma's old-school know-how was right there, hidden under every perfect homemade cookie. Grating cold butter with a cheese grater for pastry dough is one of those brilliant cookbook hacks that feels obvious once you know it. But nobody ever teaches you unless they hand down the trick. Flaky pie crust or biscuits depend on keeping your butter cold, but cutting it into flour evenly can be a nightmare, especially if your kitchen is warm. Old cookbooks solve that problem with one simple step: grate your butter like cheese. You would chill the stick, run it across the box grater, and suddenly, perfectly tiny shreds of butter fall into your flour mix. It blends faster, stays cold, and gives you that tender, flaky texture every time. Bakers back then leaned on this tip, whether they were making pies for Sunday dinner or biscuits to stretch the meal. Looking back, I cannot believe how many dense crusts or tough biscuits I struggled through before learning this. If someone had passed down this one old cookbook trick sooner, I would have been baking like a pro years ago. Saving cereal crumbs might sound like a breakfast problem, but in the 70s it was a dinner solution. The bottom of every box, those tiny broken flakes or puffed bits, were too good to waste. Instead of tossing them out, home cooks swept them into a bowl, crushed them finer with a rolling pin, and used them to coat chicken or pork chops. Cornflakes were the most popular. They gave a golden, crispy crust that clung to meat and stayed crunchy in the oven. Sometimes they were mixed with salt or paprika. Sometimes they were just dumped from the bag onto the plate. Either way, they worked. It was a fast way to fake fried chicken without needing oil or breadcrumbs. The coating crisped up in the oven and fooled most people. It proved dinner did not have to be expensive to taste great. And it taught kids something useful. Nothing should be wasted, not even cereal dust. It might not have looked fancy, but it made for one satisfying crunch. Crumbled biscuit breakfast bowls were a warm and simple way to start a cold morning when you had almost nothing left. The trick was to take yesterday's biscuits, already hard or going stale, break them into pieces, and pour over hot milk. Add a pinch of sugar, maybe a bit of cinnamon or molasses, and let the mixture soak until the biscuits softened. What you got was something between a porridge and a bread pudding. It was not fancy, but it was filling, warm, and easy on the stomach. In the 1930s, breakfast was often made from leftovers, and this one was a favorite among both children and adults. The milk made it feel rich. The sugar gave it a sweet lift. And the biscuit? That was just doing its job one more time before being truly done. It was a gentle way to begin the day, especially when the day ahead promised to be anything but gentle. This bowl of sweet, soggy comfort was more than a meal. It was a quiet promise that even the smallest things could be made useful again. Bread crust pie lattice was the ultimate make-do solution for bakers who hated to waste a single scrap. Instead of tossing out the crusts from sliced sandwich bread, especially the heels, home cooks braided or layered them across the top of a pie. You would soak the crusts briefly in a little milk or brush them with melted butter to soften them up, then shape them into rustic strips. They would toast up golden in the oven and give the pie a rough, homemade charm that you just could not fake. It was not flaky like traditional crust, but it held its shape and added a chewy, buttery layer to each slice. This trick showed up in Depression-era and wartime cookbooks as a way to conserve flour, since making a second crust from scratch was not always an option. It worked best on fruit pies or pudding pies that needed a topping but did not require full coverage. You would be surprised how many old-timers still remember this with a kind of fondness, those scrappy little pies made with crusts no one wanted. And the best part? It actually tasted pretty good. On the other hand, pemmican is a traditional food developed by indigenous peoples of North America. They were a very ideal way to preserve meat, fat, and berries all in one for long-term storage, and it's probably one of the earliest examples we have of portable food that was put in a compact form because it needed to. It was ideal for travel, trading, and quick consumption, all factors that American industries and companies would keep in mind going forward. How does all this work, though? Bison, deer, and elk are all good sources of lean meat and were herded by indigenous peoples for a long time. All the meat from these animals would be dried, either through sun-drying it or through smoking it. In place of that, rendered fat like tallow would be mixed with the powdered dried meat, and this would seal the meat, preventing any air from interacting with it and excess moisture ruining the drying process. Berries also would contain acidic compounds and antioxidants that would help kill microbe activity overall and help reduce spoilage, and the final mix of this would be molded into cakes and balls and put into compact containers. If you made pemmican properly, it could actually last all year or even more than that, and it was packed with all kinds of nutrition that were important for a nomadic lifestyle. In short, this was a wonder food, and it was built to take care of everything you would need nutritionally. When the soup pot was barely full and bellies were still empty, you cracked in an egg. That was the 70s version of a protein boost. Simple, affordable, and surprisingly filling. This had roots in Asian and European cooking, but it caught on in lean American kitchens. You whisked an egg, poured it into simmering broth, and watched it bloom into ribbons. It was fast, it was hearty, and it made a bowl of soup feel like a full meal. People did it in tomato soup, chicken broth, even vegetable stew. You did not need meat if you had one egg and a pot. It added texture, it added body, and it added staying power to meals that felt too light. This was not for show. It was survival with a bit of style. Kids watched it swirl. Parents knew it bought them a few more hours of full stomachs. Just one egg could stretch dinner. And in the 70s, that meant everything. Pudding mix. Added to cake batter for moisture is one of those sneaky little shortcuts tucked inside the pages of old community cookbooks, and it works better than most people realize. Back in the 60s and 70s, boxed cake mixes were already the hero of the busy home cook, but they did not always turn out bakery soft. That is where instant pudding mix came in. You would stir it straight into the cake batter. No fancy steps, just dump and mix. And suddenly your cake came out unbelievably moist and rich. It worked for sheet cakes, layer cakes, even cupcakes for bake sales or church potlucks. The pudding added moisture, improved the texture, and gave the cake that soft, springy bite you could never get from the plain mix alone. Honestly, I have lost count of how many dry, crumbly cakes I baked before learning this old cookbook trick. One little box of pudding mix sitting right there in the pantry, and I had no clue it could save my dessert game entirely. Using ice water for fluffier pancakes might sound backward today, but your grandma probably knew better than most people give her credit for. Pancake batter. Getting too warm? That was the quickest way to end up with flat, dense flapjacks instead of the fluffy golden stacks you remember. Grandma never let that happen. She reached for ice-cold water, or sometimes cold milk straight from the icebox, and gently stirred it into the batter, keeping everything cool and airy until it hit the hot griddle. You would sit there, fork ready, watching those pancakes puff up like little clouds, fluffy on the inside, golden brown on the edges, wondering why hers always tasted better than anyone else's. It was never luck. It was quiet kitchen skill, passed down in small, careful habits you barely noticed. Grandmas understood breakfast could make or break your whole day, and nothing lifted the mood like a plate stacked high with warm, soft pancakes. No one ever talked about the ice water trick, but they remembered the pancakes, the kind that turned an ordinary morning into something worth sitting down for, bite after bite. Stuffed cabbage with grain fillers was a shining example of kitchen ingenuity in hard times. Cabbage leaves were blanched until pliable, then wrapped around a filling of ground meat stretched with rice, oats, or even mashed potatoes. The grains weren't just filler. They turned a half-pound of meat into a full family meal. These rolls were baked in tomato sauce or simmered on the stove, letting the flavors meld. The dish was cheap, satisfying, and easy to make in large batches. It also drew from Eastern European traditions brought over by immigrants who knew how to stretch ingredients wisely. During wartime, meals like this weren't just clever, they were necessary. Government booklets encouraged home cooks to stretch meat wherever possible, and this dish did just that. Efficient, nourishing, and delicious. Some families skipped meat altogether, using seasoned rice and onions. But no matter how you made it, stuffed cabbage always meant the same thing. Someone took time to roll and wrap dinner by hand. Dandelion greens boil was not a fancy recipe, it was pure necessity pulled from the dirt. When grocery shelves were bare and even vegetables became hard to find, people looked to their backyards and roadsides. Dandelions, often treated like weeds, suddenly became dinner. You had to pick them young before they flowered, or the bitterness would be too much. Then you boiled them once to soften the fibers, drained them, and boiled them again to cut down the sharp taste. After that, you could sauté them in leftover bacon fat, toss them with vinegar, or serve them over toast if you were lucky. The result was earthy, tangy, and surprisingly good once you got used to it. It filled your stomach, gave you greens when none were growing in the market, and brought something fresh into a diet that mostly came from tins. Children might have wrinkled their noses, but grown-ups knew the value. Foraging became a quiet revolution. It reminded people that the land could still provide, even when the stores could not. And when a bowl of boiled greens kept your family going for another day, that weed in the yard started to look a whole lot like grace. Bread pudding was born out of thrift and necessity, and it was one of the sweetest tricks poor families held on to during the lean years. When loaves of bread grew stale and too hard for sandwiches, mothers refused to toss them out. Instead, they soaked the cubes in milk, added a little sugar or molasses, and baked them until the dish puffed up golden brown. If eggs were available, they went in too, but the recipe worked with whatever could be spared. Raisins, cinnamon, or even scraps of leftover jam sometimes found their way into the mix to give it more character. The result was a dessert that felt indulgent without costing anything extra. For children, it was often the only sweet treat they saw in a week, and for parents, it was proof that resourcefulness could turn waste into joy. Bread pudding tasted like comfort, and more than that, it tasted like resilience. Gelatin whipped desserts were one of those clever inventions that transformed pantry staples into something that seemed elegant, almost restaurant-worthy, even when times were tough. Housewives chilled evaporated milk, whipped it until light and fluffy, and folded it into flavored gelatin, producing a mousse-like dessert that looked fancy without costing much. The whips came in bright colors, carried a playful texture, and felt indulgent enough to appear at birthdays, Sunday dinners, and church suppers across small towns. Children were delighted by the wobble and airy feel, while parents smiled at the practicality of creating something festive out of ingredients already sitting in the cupboard. The recipe was smart because it stretched one small box of gelatin into a dessert that could serve a large family, and sometimes even more. The creamy look also masked the fact that it contained no cream, only canned milk and powdered gelatin. Food companies advertised the gelatin, but never highlighted how little it took to feed a crowd when made this way. In reality, the trick was thrift wrapped in a smile, turning frugality into celebration. Gelatin whipped desserts proved that ingenuity and joy could exist together on the table. Spam and pineapple skillet suppers were a tropical twist on the thrifty meals that defined the 1960s kitchen. Spam was cheap, filling, and shelf-stable, but it needed a little creativity to keep it interesting night after night. Moms found inspiration in Hawaiian flavors, slicing spam into cubes and browning them before adding canned pineapple chunks for sweetness. The pineapple cut through the saltiness of the spam, and when served over rice or noodles, it became a colorful, filling family dinner. This dish symbolized the way mid-century households embraced convenience foods while still searching for variety. It was inexpensive, it used pantry staples, and it carried just enough flair to feel adventurous. Kids loved the sweet and savory contrast, while parents appreciated how a single can of meat could be stretched into a full meal. Spam and pineapple skillet suppers showed how far a little canned fruit and processed meat could go when guided by ingenuity. Leftover meatloaf sandwiches were nothing fancy, but they were a weekday miracle in 70s homes. Housewives knew that one meatloaf could stretch across several meals if handled wisely, and cold slices tucked between bread made school lunches go further. A slab of meatloaf with ketchup on white bread kept kids full, while thinner slices paired with mustard and onion became work lunches for husbands. It was not wasteful, it was resourceful, and everyone felt like they got something different, even though it was the same dish. Housewives often cooked meatloaf in bigger batches for exactly this reason, knowing that leftovers were not a burden but a solution. Sandwiches transformed last night's dinner into today's lunch, which was a small act of clever planning. Families saved money without ever feeling like they were missing out on fresh food. It was frugality disguised as convenience, which is why it stayed popular through the decade. The satisfaction of pulling a ready slice from the fridge and creating a meal in seconds was the reward for thinking ahead. Oatmeal meatloaf filler was one of the thriftiest tricks church ladies ever leaned on, and it made perfect sense for families watching every penny. Instead of using up all the ground beef at once, rolled oats were mixed in to bulk out the loaf. The oats absorbed the meat's juices, stretching flavor while keeping the texture moist. It was a way to turn a pound of beef into a meal that could feed far more than it should have. For families with hungry children and guests at the table, this meant fewer empty stomachs and less money spent at the butcher. The oats themselves were cheap, easy to store, and endlessly versatile, making them a staple in every pantry. At church suppers, oatmeal-filled meatloaf was quietly common, though no one called attention to it. What mattered was that everyone got a fair slice. For many, it tasted just as hearty as the all-meat version, and the trick became part of the recipe handed down. What began as a way to survive hardship turned into a tradition of clever thrift. It was not just about saving meat, but about feeding people with dignity and ingenuity. Preserving herbs in salt was a quiet tradition in many kitchens. Fresh herbs wilted quickly, and refrigeration was not always dependable. To keep them useful, your grandfather would layer sprigs of herbs in jars with coarse salt. The salt drew out moisture, kept them green, and captured their flavor for months. Later, when soups or stews needed seasoning, a pinch from the jar carried the taste of summer gardens into winter meals. It was a simple preservation method, but it worked reliably, and the salt itself became flavored too. This made cooking more vibrant even when fresh supplies were long gone. Families treasured these jars, sometimes treating them as small luxuries when times were lean. It was a reminder that with just salt and patience, even fragile greens could last through the hardest seasons. Today we buy dried herbs in bottles, forgetting that once every home had its own jars tucked away like a hidden pantry of flavor. Maple sap water, the original sweet cooking liquid, was one of nature's purest gifts and one that Native American communities mastered long before the first colonists ever set foot in North America. In early spring, when the nights were still cold but the days warmed just enough, sap would begin to flow through the veins of maple trees. Native foragers would tap these trees carefully, gathering the clear, slightly sweet liquid that poured out. It was not yet the thick, sticky syrup we think of today. Instead, it was a crisp, refreshing, faintly sweet water that could be drunk straight or used to cook rice, stew, or even brew lightweight, revitalizing teas. To drink maple sap water was to drink hope after a brutal winter. But as delicious as maple was, native chefs had another dark, overlooked ingredient that added both flavor and unexpected health benefits to their meals. And it came straight from the heart of the fire itself. Vinegar in meringue stabilizer might not be the most glamorous kitchen tip, but it saved more pies than you can count. Mid-century bakers hated one thing above all else: weepy meringue. That sad little puddle that formed between the lemon filling and the fluffy white top was the enemy. So what did they do? They turned to vinegar. Just a teaspoon, mixed into the whipped egg whites, helped hold the structure, giving the meringue more strength and preventing collapse. It tightened the proteins, firmed up the peaks, and made for a glossier, more dependable finish. You would find this note in the tiny print of pie recipes, usually accompanied by tips like bake at low temp or spread meringue all the way to crust. It was a behind-the-scenes trick, never advertised but always appreciated. Home bakers might not have understood the science, but they knew it worked. And in an era when homemade pies were still a point of pride, a clean slice was everything. Sometimes the best tricks were the quiet ones, the ones that just made you look like you knew exactly what you were doing. Rice-stuffed baked apples were one of those meals that towed the line between dinner and dessert. Apples stored well through winter, and rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook. Together, they made something practical and gently sweet. You hollowed an apple, stuffed it with cooked rice, and baked it until it softened and started to collapse. If you had cinnamon or brown sugar, great. If not, a pat of lard did the trick. Some added milk to make it creamier. It was not fancy or meant to impress, but it filled stomachs and made children smile. In a time where smiles were hard to come by, that counted. These apples were often served after a bowl of soup or beans as a way to end on something soft. They warmed the kitchen and reminded folks that even hard times had gentle endings. Using pumpkin shells as nature's crockpots was one of the most visually stunning and practical techniques Native American cooks ever invented. Imagine carving out a big, sturdy pumpkin, filling it with a mixture of meats, roots, grains, and herbs, and setting it carefully near a low, steady fire. The thick pumpkin walls would slowly roast from the outside while the food inside simmered gently, absorbing all the sweet, nutty flavors of the squash itself. The pumpkin became pot, oven, and seasoning all in one, with no waste and no need for heavy metal tools. When the meal was ready, you simply cut into the tender pumpkin itself and ate it alongside the hearty stew it had helped create. It was a way of turning even the simplest gathering into a feast. And if you thought cooking in pumpkins was impressive, just wait until you see how native cooks used nothing but green leaves and open steam to create fish dishes that tasted like a gift straight from the earth itself. Orange juice glazed carrots were the kind of dinner party dish that felt fancier than it was. Carrots were cheap and easy to store, but no one really got excited about them until you added a splash of orange juice and a bit of butter. The acid in the juice softened the carrots just right, while the sugars caramelized slightly, giving everything a glossy finish. It made a plain root vegetable taste bright, warm, and a little unexpected. This trick started appearing in cookbooks in the 1950s and really caught on in the 1960s when citrus became a trendy flavor in savory foods. Some cooks added a dash of honey or cinnamon, while others left it clean and simple. It was easy to make, easy to scale for a crowd, and looked beautiful on the plate. This was the kind of side dish that made people feel like they were eating something a little more refined, even when it cost barely $1 to make. A little citrus went a long way, and carrots never looked back. Pressure-cooked chicken was a revelation before slow cookers became the standard in American homes, and church ladies embraced it with open arms. Using stovetop pressure cookers, they could turn tough or inexpensive cuts of poultry into tender, juicy meals in a fraction of the time it normally took. This was a godsend for busy families and for women preparing large meals for church suppers, because it saved both hours and money. Instead of roasting for long stretches, chicken could be cooked quickly, with the pressure sealing in flavor. The meat was moist, the broth rich, and the process efficient enough to keep up with the pace of community gatherings. Recipes for pressure-cooked chicken often appeared in church cookbooks, teaching new cooks how to master the technique. For families on tight budgets, this trick meant they could make poultry stretch further without losing quality. It was clever, practical, and delicious, the kind of trick that showed church ladies always knew how to work smarter in the kitchen. Pimento cheese sandwich spread was a Southern favorite that spread far and wide during the 1960s as moms searched for inexpensive, filling lunch options. The mixture was made from grated cheese, mayonnaise, and diced pimentos, stirred together into a creamy spread that could be slathered on bread or crackers. It was thrifty because it used small amounts of cheese and turned them into multiple servings, and it kept well in the refrigerator for quick meals. Kids carried pimento cheese sandwiches in lunchboxes, while adults enjoyed it as a simple snack or appetizer at gatherings. It was flavorful, easy to make, and endlessly versatile, proving that clever cooking was not always about cooking at all, but about mixing what you had. The spread became a symbol of practical indulgence, offering something creamy and tangy without requiring costly meats or elaborate ingredients. Corn fritters with syrup were a farmhouse favorite that combined savory strength and sweet comfort in one affordable dish, filling tables with both joy and practicality. Families stirred cornmeal together with eggs, flour, and either fresh or canned corn, dropping spoonfuls of batter into sizzling skillets until golden and crisp around the edges. Once fried, the fritters were stacked high on plates and drizzled generously with syrup, creating a dish that felt indulgent despite its humble ingredients. They could be served at breakfast alongside milk, at supper with beans or greens, or even eaten plain as a snack in between chores. The recipe stretched corn, one of the most dependable crops of rural life, into something that satisfied hunger and spirits alike. For children, the fritters were a treat, a rare bite of sweetness that carried excitement. For parents, they represented the assurance that no matter how little meat or money was available, the family could still share a filling meal together. Corn fritters with syrup were thrifty, hearty, and cheerful, a reminder that ingenuity could transform the simplest crop into comfort worth remembering. Their memory lingers as one of the cleverest meals born out of necessity. Ice cube trays were not just for water. In the 70s, they were also for saving summer. If you had a backyard garden or even just a few pots on the windowsill, you knew the joy and the panic of too many herbs all at once. Basil, parsley, chives, dill, they came fast and furious. But someone smart figured out how to chop them, mix them with a little water or oil, and freeze them in cubes. Pop one out midwinter, toss it in a soup or pan, and suddenly your kitchen smelled like July. It was a tiny act of planning ahead that paid off months later. This trick stretched your harvest, saved you a trip to the store, and brought real flavor to dishes long after the garden went cold. Back then, store-bought herbs were expensive and often wilted by the time you got home. But a cube of frozen oregano? That was gold. You did not need labels. Just a glance and a whiff told you what was inside. These trays lived in freezers next to casseroles and stock bags, quietly waiting to make something better. They were the secret ingredient behind a lot of "how did you make this taste so fresh?" dinners. Fooling guests with mock apple pie using crackers sounds wild today, but for grandmas back in the Depression era, it was quiet, sweet genius. Apples were scarce, but dessert was not something you skipped, especially not when company was coming. So Grandma got clever. She crushed saltine crackers, softened them with sugar, cinnamon, and just the right touch of spice, layering them into a golden pie crust so good you would swear it was made from fresh apples. You would slice in, taste the warm filling, smell the butter and cinnamon, and never suspect the trick hiding in plain sight. Grandmas never bragged. They just served it up, smiled at the compliments, and quietly stretched ingredients when fruit was hard to find. That pie was more than dessert. It was proof that with a little kitchen know-how and a lot of heart, you could turn hard times into sweet memories, one slice at a time. Turning leftover coffee into iced dessert drinks was one of those small, frugal joys hidden in the pages of old cookbooks and diner menus. Coffee was a daily essential, but wasting a single drop was out of the question when groceries were tight. So when the pot went cold, folks got creative. You would pour the leftover coffee over ice, add milk or evaporated milk, and stir in a spoonful of sugar or sweetened condensed milk. Suddenly, you had a cool, cafe-style treat at home, without paying diner prices or letting good coffee go to waste. Some even added a scoop of ice cream or a swirl of chocolate syrup when they wanted to dress it up. You would spot this trick in community cookbooks, clipped from magazines or scribbled on recipe cards. Thinking back, I dumped way too many cold coffee pots down the drain before realizing you could turn leftovers into dessert. A little milk, a little sugar, and one old cookbook tip was all it took. Vinegar as a tenderizer was one of those tricks that quietly revolutionized Depression-era cooking. Tough cuts of meat were often all you could afford, gristly, chewy, and almost impossible to enjoy unless you knew how to treat them right. That is where vinegar came in. Just a quick soak in a vinegar-based marinade would soften the meat, break down the fibers, and help it absorb flavor. You did not need anything fancy. A splash of vinegar, a little salt, and maybe some dried herbs if you had them. Let it sit for a few hours or overnight, and suddenly that cheap cut of meat became something worth savoring. It was not about masking the toughness, it was about transforming it. Vinegar brought out the best in whatever you had, and it worked just as well on vegetables too. You would see it used in greens, stews, and even in boiled dishes to brighten up bland or starchy flavors. It became a staple because it was affordable, shelf-stable, and incredibly versatile. And the best part? It gave home cooks a sense of control when everything else felt uncertain. Homemade mock sausage patties were born from necessity but stuck around because they worked. Without pork or ground meat, families turned to grains, beans, breadcrumbs, and heavy seasoning. Lentils, mashed beans, or oats were shaped into patties with garlic, sage, and onion to mimic sausage flavor. Fried in a skillet, they crisped up and filled the kitchen with a savory smell. Some added bacon grease or drippings to boost flavor. Wartime cookbooks promoted these meatless sausages as frugal and nourishing. They showed up at breakfast with eggs or tucked into lunch rolls. While they didn't fool anyone, the taste was close enough to satisfy. These patties weren't just substitutes, they were solutions, and that made them feel worth keeping. Cornbread in a skillet was the kind of dish that blended thrift and tradition with every slice, making it unforgettable in households that valued resourcefulness. Families poured cornmeal batter into hot cast-iron skillets slicked with bacon grease, letting the edges sizzle into a golden crust that crackled with flavor. The drippings gave the bread a smoky depth, turning it from plain bread into something hearty and rich without adding expensive ingredients. Housewives counted on skillet cornbread to stretch meals, cutting wedges to serve with beans, greens, or soups, so smaller servings felt filling. Children happily broke off pieces to enjoy with butter, honey, or molasses, and parents valued how it repurposed the grease left from breakfast instead of wasting it. Skillet cornbread became more than food. It was a symbol of survival and comfort, proof that one pan and cleverness could feed an entire family. It lived in the rhythm of rural kitchens, showing that homemade flavor carried power companies could never package or sell. Skillet cornbread reminded families that even simple meals, made with patience and scraps, could be deeply satisfying and memorable, and its legacy deserves to remain on the table. Hardtack with gravy was a way of reviving something almost too tough to chew into something soft and sustaining. Hardtack, that old sailor's biscuit made of just flour and water, was shelf-stable and cheap. You could find it in army rations and emergency pantries, and in the Great Depression, people brought it back out of necessity. By itself, it was like biting into a brick. But soak it in milk or water, then smother it in gravy or fat, and suddenly you had something warm and edible. The gravy could be made from bacon drippings, flour, and whatever seasonings you had on hand. Sometimes people would stir in bits of onion or mashed beans to bulk it out. The result was soft, salty, and just enough like dinner to satisfy. Kids might not have loved it, but they learned to eat it fast. It filled you up and made good use of food that was meant to last forever. In hard times, that mattered. Hardtack with gravy was a lesson in patience, in chewing, and in making do with what you had, even if what you had was practically stone. Shredded carrot in gelatin salads was a strange but oddly elegant touch that showed up all over mid-century kitchens. Back when gelatin was not just dessert, but a full-blown meal format, people liked to add texture and color to their wobbly molds. Enter the humble carrot, shredded fine and stirred into orange or lemon gelatin for a bright, crunchy twist. The sweetness of the gelatin and the mild earthiness of the carrot balanced surprisingly well, and the end result was a chilled salad that looked like sunshine on a plate. You would find it served at potlucks, funerals, church luncheons, and any meal where presentation mattered more than explanation. Sometimes folks added pineapple or raisins too, giving it a sweet-sour profile that people either loved or politely ignored. Still, the shredded carrot stuck around because it was easy, inexpensive, and made the mold feel a little more like food and less like decoration. It is one of those dishes people remember from their grandmother's house, even if they never quite liked it. But in its own weird way, it was beautiful. Using cold cellars instead of refrigerators was a practice rooted in necessity. Grandfathers dug cellars into the earth or used existing basements to store food at a steady, cool temperature. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes were kept in bins of sand or sawdust to preserve them for months. Apples were stacked carefully, and cabbages hung from rafters to slow spoilage. The earth itself provided the refrigeration, keeping food edible long after harvest. This system meant families could rely on their crops through the winter without needing electricity. It also gave a sense of security, knowing that there was always something stored below ground. Visiting the cellar to gather ingredients was part of daily routine, a reminder of careful planning and foresight. Today, we take freezers for granted, but once it was a point of pride to keep a cellar stocked. Clever, reliable, and simple, it was one of the most effective survival tricks of the time. Leftover rice pudding was one of the sweetest ways to disguise yesterday's dinner into today's dessert. Housewives baked cold rice with milk, sugar, raisins, and a shake of cinnamon until it came out warm and fragrant, filling kitchens with comfort. It was the definition of resourcefulness, transforming something bland and unwanted into a dish that families looked forward to. The chewy raisins plumped in the milk, the cinnamon gave it a cozy spice, and suddenly, leftover rice felt intentional. This recipe stretched grocery budgets by ensuring no cooked grain ever went to waste, and it became a tradition in many homes. Children often requested it, not realizing they were eating the previous night's supper in disguise. Housewives treasured recipes like these because they brought joy without expense. Rice pudding was frugal, filling, and forgiving, adapting to whatever was on hand. It turned a basic staple into something sweet enough to remember fondly decades later. Using crushed cornflakes as coating was a frugal yet clever solution that gave fried foods a golden crust without needing expensive breadcrumbs. Cornflakes were often on hand for breakfast, and when crushed, they became the perfect substitute for coating chicken, pork chops, or even vegetables. The flakes crisped beautifully when fried or baked, creating a crunchy texture that made meals feel indulgent. Moms appreciated that it saved money, reduced waste, and still delivered flavor and appeal. Kids loved the extra crunch, which turned ordinary dinners into something exciting. Sometimes seasonings or Parmesan cheese were added to the crushed flakes for variety, but the basic trick worked on its own. It was one of those small hacks that elevated everyday meals into something memorable, showing how creativity could turn a cereal box into the foundation of dinner. Spam and pineapple skillet meals were a clever pairing that made canned meat feel like something tropical and even glamorous, despite being born from necessity. Housewives sliced spam into neat cubes, browned them in a skillet, and tossed them with canned pineapple chunks, onions, and peppers. Suddenly, the salty meat transformed into a bright, sweet, and savory supper that felt fresh out of Hawaii, even when made in small kitchens thousands of miles away. Children loved the sugary bite of pineapple, while parents appreciated how quickly the dish came together on hectic nights. It carried with it a feeling of festivity, a reminder that even rationed or cheap foods could be dressed up to feel celebratory. Food companies sold the spam, but it was housewives who stretched it, making it taste like more than emergency pantry meat. The combination became a favorite for church suppers, potlucks, and weeknight dinners, remembered with surprising fondness even years later. It was clever, resourceful, and joyful all at once. Spam and pineapple skillet meals proved that frugal food did not have to be boring, and that a little creativity could elevate the humblest can into a dish worth remembering. Making DIY self-rising flour with baking powder and salt was one of those clever tricks buried in the back pages of old cookbooks. But it saved a lot of baking projects when grocery stores were not an easy option. Self-rising flour was a staple for quick breads, biscuits, pancakes, and plenty of old-school recipes, but finding it in the pantry when you needed it? That was never guaranteed. So home cooks just made their own. You would measure out plain flour, stir in the right amount of baking powder and salt, and suddenly you had fluffy, ready-to-go flour without running to the store. It saved time, money, and the headache of cutting recipes short because of one missing ingredient. This trick showed up everywhere. Handwritten recipe cards, clipped magazine tips, even scribbled in the margins of old church cookbooks. Families stretched groceries as far as they could, And little tricks like this kept meals rolling when times were tight. I spent way too many years skipping recipes, thinking I needed some fancy pre-mixed flour, when all it really took was a spoon, a bowl, and a little old cookbook wisdom. If you grew up drinking coffee in the 70s, chances are you saw someone crack an eggshell into the pot. It sounds strange, but it had roots in pioneer cooking. The idea was simple. When you boiled coffee, especially in a percolator, it could get harsh. A crushed eggshell helped mellow the bitterness. The calcium in the shell bound to acid in the grounds, and the result was smoother and more drinkable. You did not taste egg. You just got a brew that went down easier. In homes where instant coffee was frowned upon and electric machines were new, this was how you made it right. It was like adding a pinch of salt, an old tweak passed down in hushed kitchen wisdom. Coffee was serious business, especially after a long day. And if all it took was saving your eggshells and rinsing them off, that was a small price to pay. People liked their coffee strong, but not bitter. This was how they got it just right. Rolling pie dough with a glass bottle was one of those forgotten kitchen hacks tucked in the back pages of old cookbooks, but it saved many a holiday dessert. Rolling pins were not always on hand in every kitchen, especially during leaner times when gadgets took a back seat to essentials. But guess what? An old glass soda bottle did the job just as well. You would wash it, maybe chill it in the fridge, and use it to roll out pie dough as evenly as anything from a fancy kitchen shop. It worked great for cookies or crackers too. Plus, the glass stayed cool, which was exactly what you wanted for flaky pastry dough. Families back then knew how to stretch their tools and their groceries, turning simple bottles into kitchen lifesavers. If you grew up thinking baking needed expensive gear, this little trick was a game changer. Honestly, all those messy pie crust attempts of mine could have gone a lot smoother if I had known you just needed an old soda bottle and a little old-fashioned know-how. Mock whipped cream from evaporated milk was a tiny miracle that made dessert possible when dairy was scarce. You would chill a can of evaporated milk until it was icy cold, then beat it with sugar and a splash of vanilla until it fluffed up into soft peaks. It did not hold quite like real cream, but it got close enough for cake toppings, fruit bowls, or Jell-O salads. The texture was light but sturdy, and the taste had that rich, slightly caramelized edge evaporated milk is known for. It was not perfect, but it was magic in a pinch. Housewives swore by it for special occasions or Sunday suppers when a bit of sweetness was needed. Some even froze the whipped mixture for a pseudo ice cream. The trick was making the most of shelf-stable goods and transforming what seemed flat into something joyful. No one expected miracles during the Depression, but this came close. It made humble ingredients feel celebratory. And in homes where cream was just a dream, this trick kept dessert on the table and smiles in the room. Cabbage stretch soup was more than just a recipe. It was a lifeline in a pot. In times when meat was rare and vegetables limited, cabbage became the star of the soup pot. Shredded thin and simmered with water, onion, and maybe a little broth if you were lucky. It created a warm, hearty base that could feed a family for pennies. Sometimes potatoes, carrots, or bits of pasta were added to bulk it up, but cabbage was always the anchor. It had the advantage of being cheap, easy to grow, and surprisingly filling. The best part? You didn't need much else. The longer it cooked, the sweeter and more tender it became, soaking up any seasoning you threw its way. Old cookbooks and wartime manuals often included cabbage soup under sustaining meals, or meatless mains, emphasizing its value for both health and economy. Some versions were inspired by European immigrants who had long relied on cabbage in their home cooking. It's not fancy, it doesn't pretend to be, but cabbage soup meant something back then. It meant warmth on cold nights, a meal that could stretch to feed everyone, and the quiet triumph of making something out of almost nothing. Cornmeal mush was one of those dishes that seemed too plain to matter, yet it carried families through some of the hardest years of the 20th century. Cornmeal was cheap, easy to store, and available almost everywhere, making it a perfect staple for kitchens that had to make a little go a long way. Mothers would stir cornmeal into boiling water until it thickened into a soft porridge that could be served plain, sweetened with molasses or salted and fried the next morning. Fried slices of cornmeal mush were especially popular because they crisped beautifully and tasted rich without costing much. Families ate it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what else was in the pantry. Sometimes gravy was poured on top to make it feel like a proper supper, especially when meat was absent. The dish did not need much imagination to prepare, but it carried the weight of survival by being endlessly adaptable and nourishing. It was proof that even the simplest grain could keep a family fed when there was no money for flour or bread. Potato donuts were the sweet, golden proof that nothing in the kitchen needed to be wasted. When leftover mashed potatoes sat in the icebox, clever cooks mixed them with flour, sugar, eggs, and spices to create donut batter that was soft and airy. Fried until golden, the potato donuts came out tender on the inside and crisp on the outside, lasting longer than ordinary versions because the potatoes held in moisture. Rolled in sugar or glazed, they quickly became favorites in homes where thrift and flavor had to coexist. For children, these donuts felt like a treat on par with bakery sweets, even though they were born out of leftovers. Housewives loved how reliable they were, stretching scraps into something people would ask for again and again. It was the kind of kitchen hack that carried families through holidays and everyday mornings alike, filling homes with the smell of frying dough and cinnamon. Potato donuts reminded everyone that resourcefulness did not mean sacrifice, it meant creating joy out of what was already there. Canned green bean bundles were as much about presentation as they were about thrift. Housewives took humble canned beans, wrapped them with strips of bacon, and baked them into tidy little packages that looked far fancier than the ingredients suggested. Suddenly, the cheapest vegetable in the pantry became a party dish. They were easy to pick up, easy to serve, and they made families feel like they were dining in style. Kids who might have turned up their noses at plain beans were suddenly intrigued by the crispy bacon wrapping. It was one of those recipes that cost very little but carried big impact. Guests assumed it was a restaurant-inspired dish, not realizing it came straight from a can. Housewives kept these tricks up their sleeves to add flair without adding expense. They were little bites of ingenuity that showed just how far simple ingredients could be stretched when creativity came first. Applesauce as an oil substitute was one of the smartest baking swaps passed down by church ladies, and it still works today. When oil was too expensive or hard to find, women stirred applesauce into cakes, muffins, or quick breads. The result was a moist crumb and a light sweetness that made every slice taste richer. It was a brilliant solution because apples were plentiful and easy to preserve in jars. Families with apple trees especially relied on this trick, turning harvests into year-round supplies for baking. The swap not only stretched ingredients, but also made recipes feel healthier at a time when nutrition was on everyone's mind. Cakes made this way often carried a subtle fruitiness that made them stand out from heavier versions. Bake sales and potlucks saw many applesauce cakes, their recipes proudly shared between friends. This clever trick also meant that a family could enjoy dessert even when oil rations were low. It was resourcefulness at its best, proving that flavor and thrift could live hand in hand. With each slice, people tasted both ingenuity and comfort, a perfect reflection of church kitchen wisdom. How native chefs made instant trail mix with dried berries and nuts is a perfect example of simple genius meeting real-world survival. Long before colorful packages lined grocery store shelves, Native American communities were gathering handfuls of nature's purest energy foods, drying them carefully under the sun, and combining them into powerful portable meals. Wild berries like chokecherry, elderberry, and wild strawberries were prized for their tartness and nutrition, while nuts like acorns, walnuts, and pine nuts packed a heavy punch of fat and protein. Some tribes even added roasted seeds, puffed grains, or strips of dried meat for extra stamina. The goal was not just taste, but endurance. It was survival in your pocket, designed by thousands of years of knowledge. And while they packed sweetness and strength into every bite, when it came to seasoning savory meals, native chefs turned to another source altogether: wild plants that turned every piece of meat into pure wilderness flavor. Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Bacon grease as a biscuit fat substitute was not just clever, it was common sense. When butter was too pricey or scarce and shortening was rationed, folks used what was already in the pan. Bacon grease, saved in a can or jar near the stove, became the go-to for biscuits, cornbread, and frying. It added depth, richness, and just a hint of smoke. Strained to remove bits, chilled until firm, it worked like lard and made everything taste better. You saw it in Southern cookbooks, recipe cards, and wartime pamphlets. For many, it was just the way things were done, and if someone threw it out, they probably did not grow up cooking. It was humble, it was honest, and it made unforgettable biscuits. Using charcoal powder to enhance meat flavor and aid digestion sounds almost too wild to be real, but for Native American cooks, it was a smart, practical tool built from hard-earned wisdom. After a fire burned down to pure white coals, small amounts of fine charcoal powder were sometimes sprinkled over cooking meats or even mixed into marinades. The charcoal acted as a natural purifier, absorbing toxins and helping break down tough fibers inside the meat, making it not only more flavorful but also easier on the stomach. Some healers even mixed tiny amounts into drinking water after big meals, trusting charcoal's natural ability to soothe digestion and guard against sickness. It tasted like the earth, the fire, and the sky, all wrapped up into one unforgettable bite. And if you thought using charcoal was clever, wait until you hear about how deer fat candles turned slow basting into an art form that even today's chefs can barely rival. Now, you've probably heard your grandmother emphasize the importance of always keeping your pasta dry. But have you ever thought about why that is? The thing with drying pasta is that besides just avoiding basic issues like how it clumps together, becomes the worst thing ever to eat, and just loses its freshness, you really just want to preserve pasta because of one simple concept: moisture content. Like we've discussed before, moisture is something that bacteria and mold need desperately to grow. If they don't get it, they're liable to have a breakdown, figuratively and literally. This is why drying pasta has been such a tradition in Italian culture and just about everywhere that popularly consumes it. Drying your pasta reduces the water content by a good 15%, and that helps the pasta achieve a much higher shelf life. I'm talking months, and if you really know how to preserve, then even years. Don't believe me? Trust me, there's an Italian on YouTube with an essay on it. Crisping cracklings for cornbread was a favorite move in kitchens where nothing was wasted. When pork was rendered for fat, the crunchy bits left behind were saved as cracklings. Grandfathers stirred these into cornbread batter before baking, adding texture, flavor, and protein. The result was a golden pan of cornbread with crisp surprises in every bite. It was filling, nutritious, and kept families satisfied when meat was scarce. Crackling cornbread became more than food. It was a memory of gatherings around the table, where every slice carried the taste of thrift and ingenuity. This simple addition turned a humble bread into a complete meal. Served with beans or greens, it could keep a family full for hours. The practice showed how every part of an animal was valued, down to the last crunchy morsel. Today, the idea seems unusual, but back then, cracklings in cornbread were a sign of clever cooking and smart living. Cinnamon sugar pie crust twists were one of those clever snacks that made sure nothing ever went to waste in a church kitchen. When there was leftover pie dough from baking, it was rolled out, brushed with a little butter, and sprinkled with sugar and cinnamon before being cut into strips and baked until crisp. What came out of the oven were sweet, flaky little cookies that filled the kitchen with the smell of spice. They were perfect for children who came running in after service, eager for a bite of something warm. These twists were quick to make, cost nothing extra, and gave a sense of thriftiness that still felt indulgent. At church socials, trays of them would disappear in minutes because they were easy to grab and eat by hand. Many families passed down this trick as part of their pie baking routine, treating it as the baker's reward for making dessert. They were a small joy born from careful use of every scrap, and their memory lingers in the kitchens where nothing was ever wasted. Powdered milk baking was one of those quiet tricks that kept households running smoothly when the weekly grocery money did not stretch far. Housewives discovered that adding powdered milk to bread, cookies, or cakes meant saving the fresh milk for children's glasses and breakfast cereals. The powdered version blended easily with dry ingredients, gave baked goods structure, and cost less per serving than cartons of fresh milk. It was a compromise that felt almost invisible, because once mixed and baked, no one could tell the difference. Some even claimed it gave breads a slightly denser crumb, which made sandwiches hold up better in lunchboxes. This practice turned powdered milk from a pantry backup into an everyday ingredient, one that showed just how resourceful homemakers were with substitutions. It was not glamorous, but it was practical, and it allowed mothers to stretch supplies without sacrificing family traditions like fresh cookies after school. Powdered milk became a symbol of thrift masked as normalcy, proof that cleverness often lay in the smallest details of a recipe. A boiled dinner was one of the heartiest frugal meals poor families relied on, born from the idea that you could simmer almost anything together and create a dish filling enough to last for days. The base usually included bits of inexpensive meat or even bones that were boiled slowly with potatoes, cabbage, and turnips. The long cooking time softened the vegetables and drew every bit of flavor out of the meat scraps, creating a broth that felt rich even if little protein was used. Nothing was wasted, and leftovers were often saved and reheated for the next day, with new vegetables added to stretch it further. This kind of dish was common in rural households and immigrant communities where thrift was already a way of life. It brought warmth in the winter and offered the satisfaction of a stew without the cost of a heavy roast or expensive cuts. Families valued boiled dinners not only for nourishment, but also because they fed large households with minimal effort. It was the kind of meal that could be adjusted endlessly depending on what was available, and it gave poor families the assurance that no one would leave the table hungry, no matter how little was in the pantry. The vegetable scrap stockpot was less a recipe and more a mindset. In homes where waste wasn't an option, every peel, stem, and stub found a second life. Onion skins, carrot tops, celery leaves, and even wilted herbs all went into a pot of water, simmering quietly on the stove. The result was a rich, flavorful broth that cost nothing but time. This stock formed the base of soups, stews, gravies, and casseroles during the 1930s and 40s, especially when meat broth was too costly. Some families even kept a container in the fridge labeled stock scraps, filling it until it was time to boil a batch. It was communal cooking at its core, neighbors sharing tricks, reminding one another that everything still had value. Today, we'd call it sustainable. Back then, it was just good sense. And when you think of a soup that starts with scraps and ends in comfort, you see why this method lasted. Homemade cracker crumbs were a quiet staple in every frugal kitchen. When flour was rationed or store-bought breadcrumbs ran out, cooks turned to saltines. Crushed with a rolling pin or jar, saltine crumbs became a cheap, dependable substitute for flour in coating, binding, and topping dishes. They were used to bread fish, stretch meatloaf, thicken casseroles, or crisp up baked vegetables. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 50s recommended cracker crumbs in almost every savory recipe, and even some sweet ones. Their long shelf life and crisp texture made them a pantry hero. A box of saltines could last weeks, and the final stale bits were never wasted, just crushed into crumbs and reused. Some families seasoned the crumbs with herbs or onion powder to add flavor when cheese or spices were out of reach. It was a quiet trick that helped meals taste better when money was tight. A handful of saltine crumbs, used wisely, went farther than anyone expected. Grated apple as a sugar substitute was one of the best-kept secrets of Depression baking. When sugar was rationed or simply too expensive to justify, people turned to fruit, especially apples, to sweeten their dishes naturally. You would peel them, grate them fine, and fold the pulp into cakes, breads, or puddings to bring moisture and sweetness without using up precious pantry staples. It was not the exact same as sugar, but it worked surprisingly well. The apples added flavor, kept things tender, and helped stretch recipes that otherwise would have come up short. Sometimes you would use them on their own. Other times they got mixed with a spoonful or two of whatever sugar you had left, just to bring it over the line. Tart apples like Granny Smith worked best in baked goods, while sweeter varieties were used in cold puddings or compotes. The trick was simple, but it made a big difference. Every apple grated was a little gift back to the kitchen, a way of saying, "We are not out yet." Even now, a lot of older recipes still carry the echoes of this trick. There was something oddly indulgent about pouring hot coffee over day-old cake. It was not just about softening a dry crumb, it was about turning a leftover into a little bit of luxury. You took a slice of pound cake, maybe a piece of cornbread, or even the last bit of chocolate sheet cake, and set it in a shallow bowl. Then you poured strong hot coffee right over the top. The cake soaked it in like a sponge, turning soft and warm, with a bitter edge that balanced the sweetness. It became a cross between breakfast and dessert, often eaten quietly in the morning or late at night when no one else was around. You did not need frosting. You did not need ice cream, just a fork and a moment. Some people added cream or sugar to the coffee before pouring. Others kept it black and sharp. It was a thrifty move, sure, but it also felt like a ritual, like something you learned by watching someone else do it, maybe with tired eyes and a quiet kitchen. Not every trick is about flash. Some are about comfort, and this one brought it, one warm bite at a time. Gravy over rice might sound like a side dish today, but in the 1930s, it was often the main event. When meat was scarce and vegetables were few, the leftover drippings from a roast, or even just some bacon grease and flour, got turned into gravy. Pour that over a pot of plain boiled rice, and suddenly you had dinner. It was salty, it was filling, and it used things that might otherwise go to waste. Gravy made even the blandest starch taste rich, and rice was a cheap staple that went a long way. Families would keep jars of fat and reuse every spoonful, sometimes adding a splash of milk or a bit of onion for extra depth. It was not about variety, it was about sustenance. One bowl of this could keep you full through a whole day's work, and that was all anyone hoped for. Some children grew up thinking this was a real meal, not realizing it was born of necessity. It was practical, thrifty, and as comforting as it was humbling. You did not need a feast. You just needed something hot, salty, and spoonable. Mashed peas as sandwich spread was one of those strange little inventions that stuck around longer than anyone expected. When meat was scarce and deli slices were a luxury, people turned to vegetables for sandwich fillings. Peas, cooked, mashed, and mixed with mayonnaise or mustard, became a go-to choice. The texture was creamy, the flavor mild and earthy, and the color a cheerful green that stood out on soft white bread. You might find it alongside shredded lettuce, thinly sliced pickles, or even a hard-boiled egg. Sometimes people added a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar to punch it up. It was not about loving peas, it was about having something hearty to spread between two slices. This trick showed up in wartime and Depression-era lunchbox guides, often marketed as a nutritious, affordable alternative to ham or tuna salad. And oddly enough, for a generation raised on making do, it became a taste they remembered fondly. It was cheap, it was strange, and it worked. If you would bury root vegetables in the crown, then you were literally taking advantage of the natural regulation of the earth. This was a common practice that people did to keep vegetables as fresh as they could be and extend their shelf life, and it was something you'd see a lot throughout the winter. Basically, in the colder months, since the ground tends to maintain a consistently cool temperature, it helps slow the metabolic process of most vegetables down. This helps to stave off the decaying process, but the temperature of the soil during the winter is actually a lot lower than you think. It's literally just a few degrees Fahrenheit above the freezing point, and this way, not only do you get to preserve your fruit, but the overall nutritional content and texture get preserved too. Most vegetables also really need to be hydrated properly, or they'll shrivel up and die, and soil acts as a natural wellspring of moisture, so you get that covered easily. Popcorn before microwaves meant a pan on the stove or a paper bag in the oven. And in the 70s, that brown bag trick was a hit. You poured in kernels, added oil, folded the top, and set it in the oven. Soon the bag puffed, and the smell of corn filled the kitchen. No machines, no air poppers, just a lunch bag doing double duty. It was budget-friendly, clean, and fun. Kids listened for the first pop and counted the seconds. Once it slowed, the bag came out, hot, a little oily, and ready to rip open. Salt went in, maybe butter, and the whole thing was shaken and shared. Sometimes it stayed in the bag. Sometimes it went into a big bowl. Either way, it was perfect, and it cost just cents. That was 70s snacking, smart and satisfying. Melting marshmallows for quick dessert frosting feels like something straight out of a child's birthday party, but it came from clever old-school cookbook tricks. Back when frosting ingredients like cream or butter were scarce or pricey, families found a shortcut hiding in the pantry: marshmallows. You would melt them down with a splash of milk and spread the gooey mix right over cakes or cupcakes. It cooled into a glossy, fluffy frosting that looked impressive without the time or cost of traditional icing. You would find this trick in community cookbooks and on the back of marshmallow packages from the 60s and 70s. It turned plain cakes into party showstoppers with almost no effort. Thinking back on all those rushed birthdays or last-minute bake sales, I cannot help but wish I had this shortcut sooner. One bag of marshmallows, one old cookbook, and dessert was saved. Keeping pie fillings from sogging crust with breadcrumbs was one of those old kitchen tricks Grandma never mentioned out loud, but you saw the results every time dessert hit the table. You would slice into a peach, apple, or berry pie and wonder how the bottom crust stayed crisp and flaky, never soggy or gummy like store-bought versions. The answer was not luck. It was breadcrumbs. Grandma sprinkled a light layer of them under the fruit filling, where they quietly soaked up excess juices, protecting the crust without changing the flavor. No one tasted breadcrumbs, but everyone noticed how perfect that pie held together. Grandmas learned long ago that good cooking came down to small, clever steps no one ever bragged about. Those breadcrumbs saved pies, saved messes, and turned humble desserts into bakery-worthy creations with nothing more than quiet, everyday know-how passed down through generations. Fried potato skins were a shining example of the rule that nothing could be wasted in a poor household. When potatoes were peeled for soups or stews, the skins were not discarded but saved, washed, and fried in fat until they turned crisp. Sprinkled with salt, they became a cheap side dish or snack that added a bit of variety to meals that were otherwise repetitive. Children often loved them because they were crunchy and fun to eat, like a homemade chip. Parents valued them because they made use of every part of the potato, turning scraps into food. In communities where bartering was common, fried skins were even traded for other small goods, proving their worth beyond the dinner table. This dish taught families the value of thrift in the kitchen, where waste was not an option. Fried potato skins might have been born of necessity, but they ended up being one of the most beloved frugal tricks that turned scraps into satisfaction. Making soup from scraps was a tradition built on necessity and thrift. Onion skins, carrot tops, celery leaves, and bones that others might throw away were collected and simmered into broths. Nothing was wasted, and every bit of flavor was coaxed from ingredients that seemed past their usefulness. Grandfathers knew that scraps still carried value, and a pot of soup could feed a family with hardly any fresh ingredients. The broth would simmer slowly, filling the house with comforting aromas that belied its humble beginnings. Vegetables, noodles, or grains were often added to turn the broth into a full meal. This practice meant fewer trips to the market and more meals from the same supply. It was not only practical but also a reminder of resourcefulness in hard times. Families ate well because someone knew how to turn scraps into sustenance. Soup from scraps may sound simple today, but it was once a mark of clever survival in the kitchen. Potato donuts might sound strange today, but in thrifty kitchens of the past, they were a clever way to stretch ingredients and make a treat feel more filling. Leftover mashed potatoes or grated boiled potatoes were mixed right into the dough, giving the donuts a soft, moist texture that regular flour alone could not match. A splash of milk, a spoonful of sugar, and a dash of nutmeg or cinnamon turned the plain mixture into something that felt special. Once fried, the outside crisped up golden, while the inside stayed tender and just slightly chewy. Sometimes they were dusted with powdered sugar or rolled in cinnamon sugar, and sometimes they were enjoyed plain with a hot cup of coffee. Families swore by them as a way to avoid waste, and children loved the novelty of a donut that tasted a little different. Potato donuts proved resourcefulness could turn scraps into a sweet indulgence. Old-fashioned corn pudding was sweet, soft, and surprisingly hearty, especially for something that came from such humble beginnings. In the 1930s, cornmeal was dirt cheap and endlessly useful, and this dish was one of the cleverest ways to turn it into a filling side: a bit of cornmeal, water or milk, and just enough sugar to make it feel special. Eggs were sometimes added, but often it was just flour, grease, and corn. It came out like a custard or a thick bread pudding, depending on what you had. Baked slowly, it developed a crust on top and a warm, spoonable inside that made it a family favorite. People would eat it hot out of the oven or cold the next morning, sometimes drizzled with molasses or a pat of margarine. It was both side dish and dessert, depending on your mood. There were no store-bought sweets for most folks back then, so corn pudding gave just enough sugar and softness to count as a treat. And for children, it was a rare bite of comfort in a world where food often felt like medicine. It was poor man's pudding, but it tasted like something richer. Boiling cake batter on the stove might sound strange today, but it was a common step in many old recipes. It was especially popular in homes where oven space was limited or kitchens got too hot in summer. The process started with heating butter, water, sugar, and cocoa, or sometimes spice, in a saucepan. Once it bubbled, you took it off the heat and stirred in flour, eggs, and baking soda. The result? A smooth, shiny batter that baked into cakes with a dense, moist crumb and a texture somewhere between fudge and sponge. These were not airy birthday cakes. These were rich, reliable tray bakes made to be sliced into squares and wrapped in wax paper for school lunches. The stovetop step made the flavors blend deeper, especially in chocolate versions. It also saved time. No need for a mixer or multiple bowls. You made it all in one pot. Some versions doubled as brownie recipes. Others used leftover coffee or fruit preserves for extra depth. But they all shared the same start: a pot on the stove and a wooden spoon. These cakes may have come from necessity, but they earned their place on every table they touched. Stretching cake. Frosting with whipped evaporated milk was one of those genius dessert tricks that got lost along the way, but it saved countless birthday parties and bake sales in its heyday. Butter and cream were expensive, especially during tight times or rationing, but home cooks still needed a way to frost cakes and keep things looking fancy. That is where chilled evaporated milk came in. You would stick the can in the fridge overnight, pour it into a bowl, and whip it up like cream. It fluffed into a light, airy frosting that stretched farther than any butter-based recipe and cost a fraction of the price. You would find this tip in old dessert books, church cookbooks, and handwritten recipe cards tucked in family drawers. It made cakes look bakery-worthy, even when grocery budgets were stretched thin. Thinking back, I ruined enough frosting jobs trying to stretch butter alone. I wish someone had handed me this old cookbook hack sooner. Turning potato water into soup base was one of those humble, brilliant moves Grandma pulled off without ever calling attention to it. After boiling potatoes for dinner, most folks drained that cloudy, starchy water straight into the sink, but Grandma never wasted a thing, especially not something so useful. That leftover water, rich with starch and nutrients, became the foundation for hearty soups, creamy gravies, and even stews that tasted like they simmered for hours. It added body, a little thickness, and a subtle, earthy flavor that brought everything together without needing expensive stock or extra ingredients. Grandma's knew meals had to stretch, groceries had to last, and waste was never an option. You would sip that soup, warm, rich, and filling, and never guess it started with something most people tossed away. It was resourceful, practical cooking, quiet genius passed down through generations, born from hard times but still making meals better today. Water pie trick was the kind of invention you only believe once you taste it. Made from water, sugar, flour, and a bit of butter or lard if you had it, the mixture set into a sweet, custard-like filling as it baked. It was strange and magical, a pie with no fruit, no eggs, no milk, but still somehow soft and sliceable. You poured the mix into a simple crust, maybe even a cracker crust, and baked until it barely jiggled. Cinnamon or vanilla could be added for flavor, but even plain, it worked. Some called it desperation pie. Others just called it dessert. It was born out of bare cupboards and stubbornness, the need to bring something sweet to the table when nothing sweet remained, and it proved that even in the leanest moments, a little sugar and flour could still create something worth serving. Sour milk baking substitutes were a reliable trick from the old kitchen playbook. When milk spoiled, and it often did without refrigeration, homemakers didn't panic. They baked with it. The acidity of sour milk, paired with a bit of baking soda, gave baked goods a fluffy rise and a rich flavor that mimicked buttermilk. Cookbooks from the 1930s and 40s treated sour milk like an essential, with entire sections dedicated to how to use it in cakes, biscuits, or pancakes. Some cooks even soured fresh milk intentionally with lemon juice or vinegar just to keep recipes consistent. And it wasn't just about avoiding waste. It was also about making delicious, fluffy food out of things that would have otherwise been tossed. Housewives during wartime learned to see every ingredient as usable, and sour milk was no different. Even today, some bakers still insist that sour milk makes better cornbread than anything else. It was one of those tricks that stuck because it worked, and because it proved that even spoiled food could still feed a family. Mock apple pie with Ritz crackers was one of the cleverest desserts to come out of kitchens that had to make something from nothing. Instead of apples, families used crushed crackers soaked with sugar syrup, lemon juice, and a bit of cinnamon, baking it all in a flaky crust. The crackers softened and took on the texture of apples, fooling almost anyone into believing they were eating real fruit. Food companies promoted it to sell crackers, but housewives embraced it as a secret hack that made dessert possible without expensive produce. At the table, no one cared if apples were missing. The flavor was close enough, and the joy of pie was still there. Children thought it was a marvel, and adults appreciated the thrift behind it. This dish showed that resourcefulness was sometimes more impressive than luxury, proving that flavor did not always depend on what you had, but on what you could make out of very little. Mock fish fillets were a prime example of how poor families learned to satisfy cravings for foods they could not afford. Fresh fish was often too expensive or simply unavailable, so mothers recreated it by using mashed beans, potatoes, or even softened bread shaped into patties and fried until golden brown. With the right seasoning and texture, the finished product resembled a fish fillet closely enough to fool the taste buds. The flavor came from onions, parsley, and pepper, if the family could spare them, and the frying process gave the patties a satisfying crunch. These imitations were not made to trick anyone into thinking they had fish, but to bring variety and novelty to dinner tables that would otherwise grow monotonous. Children enjoyed the playful presentation, while parents knew it was an affordable way to serve something that felt special. The recipe was passed around in community cookbooks, each household tweaking it with what they had on hand. It was not glamorous, but it made people smile and fed them well, which was what mattered most. Mock fish fillets showed that even when real seafood was out of reach, ingenuity could bring a sense of abundance back into the home kitchen. Saltine cracker pie crusts might sound like desperation, but they were actually ingenious. When graham crackers were too expensive or simply unavailable, housewives crushed saltines, mixed them with butter and sugar, and pressed them into pie pans. Once baked, they made a surprisingly crisp and sturdy base that carried fillings as well as any graham crust. This trick stretched dessert options and allowed pies to appear regularly on tables that might not have afforded them otherwise. The slight saltiness of the crackers paired well with sweet custards or fruit fillings, making the pies memorable in their own right. Children never knew the difference, and guests often assumed it was just another creative recipe passed down through family lines. It was yet another example of the ingenuity that marked 70s kitchens, where substitutions did not feel like sacrifice. Housewives knew that as long as it looked polished and tasted good, no one asked questions. Canned milk frosting was a budget-friendly way to make desserts feel indulgent without using expensive cream. By whipping evaporated milk with sugar and flavorings, church ladies created a smooth, fluffy icing that paired perfectly with cakes or cookies. It was cheaper, easier to store, and still had the richness people craved. The trick meant even families with limited access to dairy could enjoy frosted treats. At bake sales, cakes topped with this kind of icing sold quickly because they looked just as beautiful as any bakery creation. The flavor was subtly caramelized, which made it stand out from regular buttercream. Children loved it because it was sweet and soft, while adults admired the thrift behind it. Community cookbooks often included this recipe, passing it from one household to another. It showed that indulgence did not always need expensive ingredients, just clever thinking. Frosting made this way was not only practical, but also memorable, leaving behind a taste tied to church gatherings. It was a simple solution that brought sweetness to tables everywhere. Reviving stale bread with steam was one of those clever moves that saved money and waste. When a loaf turned hard and dry, most people today would throw it out. Your grandfather knew better. He wrapped the bread in a damp towel, placed it in a warm oven, and let the steam soften it back to life. In just a short while, what seemed like a brick could be sliced and eaten as if fresh from the bakery. It was not only practical, but also comforting to know that no food needed to be wasted. Families learned to stretch every loaf, and the trick became second nature in kitchens across America. A simple towel and a little patience turned leftovers into tomorrow's breakfast toast. Children never noticed that the bread had been on its last leg. It was one more way a clever hand in the kitchen turned hardship into something that felt almost magical. Hot dog octopus garnish is what happens when creativity meets childhood joy. Mid-century party cookbooks, especially the ones aimed at birthday parties or school lunches, loved a good gimmick. And turning an ordinary hot dog into a smiling octopus? That was peak culinary fun for kids. The trick was simple. Slice one end of a hot dog into strips, boil it for a minute or two, and watch the legs curl outward like tentacles. The result was a goofy, wiggly hot dog that looked like it belonged in a cartoon and tasted like backyard summer. Parents would set them on top of mac and cheese, mashed potatoes, or even tuck them into lunchboxes with a smiley face drawn in mustard. It cost next to nothing but made kids feel like they were eating something special. These octopus dogs became so popular that some cookbooks devoted whole sections to fun food just like it. It was a different kind of food styling, one that made meals exciting without any fuss or frosting. And really, when you are 5 years old, who would not love a sea creature made of meat? Grated raw potato pancakes were born out of pure necessity and just a little bit of grease. All you needed was a couple of raw potatoes, some flour to bind, an onion if you had it, and a hot skillet. Shred it all fine, press out the water, mix it together, and fry until golden. What came out was crispy at the edges, soft in the middle, and filling enough to count as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. These pancakes did not pretend to be fancy, they just showed up and got the job done. Potatoes were the backbone of many meals in the 1930s because they were cheap, lasted forever in storage, and grew in poor soil. You could trade for them, grow them, and feed a family for days with just a sack. These cakes were sometimes topped with applesauce or served alongside beans or eaten plain and hot off the pan. They were adaptable, frugal, and satisfying. A hot cake in a cold kitchen was enough to lift your spirits a bit. That crunch meant you were doing okay, at least for today. Canning tomatoes on the porch was as much a tradition as it was a necessity. When the summer gardens produced more than anyone could eat, your grandfather and grandmother would set up boiling pots outdoors to bottle the extras. It kept the kitchen cool and gave them room to work with cases of jars and baskets of fruit. The sound of lids popping tight meant food for the winter, long after the vines had withered. Fresh tomatoes were peeled, cooked down and sealed away, ready to become soups, sauces, or stews months later. The porch became a workshop of bubbling water, steam rising in the heat, and neighbors lending a hand. It was not only about storage, but also about pride in keeping the harvest alive. Families relied on those jars when store shelves were bare or when money was thin. Today, canning has almost vanished, but back then it was the quiet heartbeat of survival and togetherness. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this. You have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Homemade cheese straws were crunchy, salty snacks that made housewives look like professional bakers without the effort. Strips of biscuit dough were twisted with cheese powder or grated cheddar, then baked until crisp and golden. They were served at bridge clubs, parties, and holiday gatherings, vanishing quickly from trays. Their appeal lay in their simplicity, a handful of ingredients transformed into something addictive. Children munched them with tomato soup, while adults paired them with cocktails, and everyone assumed they took far more work than they did. Housewives leaned on recipes like this to show skill without expense, because flour, cheese, and butter were always cheaper than buying packaged snacks. The straws were easy to shape into spirals or sticks, and they always looked festive on the table. For many families, they became the taste of togetherness, reminding everyone that a homemade touch carried more love than anything store-bought. Vienna sausages wrapped in crescent dough were one of the era's most popular party tricks, combining frugality with fun. Crescent roll dough came in refrigerated tubes that made baking simple, while canned Vienna sausages were inexpensive and easy to keep on hand. Moms wrapped small sausages in triangles of dough, baked them until golden, and served them as appetizers that looked festive without requiring much money or time. These bite-sized treats felt indulgent at potlucks or parties, giving the illusion of abundance even when budgets were thin. Kids loved them because they were playful finger food, and adults appreciated them as a clever way to make canned meat feel special. They showed how presentation could elevate even the humblest ingredients, turning ordinary pantry staples into something worthy of celebration. Vienna sausages wrapped in crescent dough remain a nostalgic reminder of how 1960s moms brought joy and ingenuity to their kitchens, even when resources were limited. Homemade salad dressing powders were a thrifty answer to the expensive seasoning packets companies tried to market, and families created them from ordinary pantry spices. Housewives mixed onion powder, garlic powder, dried herbs, salt, and pepper together, storing the blend in jars that could be whisked with oil and vinegar whenever needed. The result was dressings as flavorful as store mixes, but without the ongoing expense, and each household adapted the recipe to its own taste. Families enjoyed adding more herbs, experimenting with paprika, or stirring in sugar for a sweeter version. It encouraged people to use vegetables more often, because salad suddenly felt exciting again without breaking the budget. Housewives loved the independence of never relying on store packets, and children enjoyed the fresh taste without realizing it was homemade. It was practical, empowering, and inexpensive, proving that commercial convenience was never truly essential. These powders became a secret weapon in thrifty kitchens, spreading flavor and saving money at once. They turned simple greens into something families wanted to eat. In the end, homemade salad dressing powders were part creativity, part quiet rebellion, a forgotten trick that deserves recognition. Baked beans with salt pork was one of the most filling and affordable meals families relied on when meat was in short supply. Beans were cheap, easy to store, and packed with protein, making them a dependable staple in poor households. Adding a small cube of salt pork gave the dish a smoky flavor that made it feel like a complete dinner. Families would put the pot on early in the day, letting the beans cook slowly until tender while the pork released its flavor. The result was a dish that fed large families and could be stretched across multiple meals. Often leftovers were reheated and eaten with bread, making it last even longer. It was a recipe that proved how a tiny bit of meat could transform an otherwise plain pot of beans into something hearty and satisfying. For many people, baked beans with salt pork became more than just dinner. It became a tradition that represented the ingenuity and survival spirit of struggling households. Salt pork scraps and beans delivered bold flavor on a tight budget. Even the tiniest pieces of salt pork, often trimmed from larger cuts or saved in a jar, were enough to enrich an entire pot of beans. Sautéed first to release their fat, these bits added smoky, salty depth to navy beans, black-eyed peas, or pintos. You didn't need much, just enough to give the dish character. This trick was especially popular in Southern kitchens and appeared in many WPA cookbooks under economy meals. Beans were cheap, hearty, and easy to grow or store, but the salt pork made them feel like more than just filler. If you had onions or garlic, those went in too. The goal was to create something warming and flavorful from almost nothing, and it worked. Families remembered these dishes long after better cuts of meat returned to the table. For many, beans and pork scraps were more than a backup. They were a tradition. One pot could feed a family and still leave enough for lunch the next day. Stale cracker crusts were a Depression-era fix that turned kitchen failures into something functional and often delicious. When crackers went soft from humidity or sat too long on the shelf, they were not thrown away. Instead, folks crushed them down, mixed them with fat, usually lard or drippings, and pressed them into pie tins to form makeshift crusts. It worked for savory pies, especially meat or vegetable ones, where the cracker flavor gave a bit of saltiness and crunch. Some people toasted the crumbs first to bring out a nuttier flavor. Others just used what they had and hoped for the best. These crusts held up surprisingly well under thick fillings like potato hash, fish, or bean casseroles. They did not flake like pastry, but they gave each bite a satisfying heft. And best of all, they made use of something that would otherwise be wasted. In that way, they were more than just a substitution. They were a symbol of resilience. When the cupboards were bare and dinner depended on scraps, a stale cracker crust could hold the whole thing together. Tricking kids with hidden veggies and meatloaf was the kind of sneaky, brilliant move Grandma pulled off all the time, and no one ever caught on. Meat was expensive, vegetables were necessary, but getting kids to eat them? That was a battle in itself. So Grandma got clever. She finely grated carrots, zucchini, onions, sometimes even spinach. So small they blended right into the meatloaf mix. Along with breadcrumbs, herbs, and seasonings, those veggies disappeared into the loaf, stretching the protein and sneaking in nutrients at the same time. The kids never knew, and honestly, neither did most of the adults. They just ate slice after slice, never suspecting their dinner was doing double duty. Grandmas understood meals had to fill bellies, stretch ingredients, and keep everyone healthy, all without turning dinner into a fight. It was quiet kitchen know-how, tucked into every bite, passed down through generations, keeping meals hearty and homes happy. Lining cake? Pans with wax paper for easy release was one of those forgotten lifesavers that old cookbooks quietly handed down. And honestly, I wish someone taught me this sooner. You ever bake a cake, flip the pan over, and half the thing stays stuck inside? That was practically a rite of passage before non-stick pans and silicone bakeware came along. but cooks in the 50s and 60s had a fix for that. You would trace the bottom of your cake pan onto wax paper, cut out a neat circle, and lay it inside before pouring in your batter. The cake would bake, rise, and come out perfect. No crumbling edges, no stuck bottoms, no broken birthday cakes when it really mattered. It was such a simple little step that made baking feel foolproof, even when the recipe felt overwhelming. You would find this tip in church cookbooks, handwritten family recipes, and tucked away in those little pamphlets that came with baking powder or shortening. Thinking back on the number of mangled cakes I tried to salvage with extra frosting, I cannot believe I skipped this one for so long. One roll of wax paper really changed the whole game. Brown sugar has a mind of its own. One minute it is soft and scoopable. The next it is a rock-solid lump buried in the back of your pantry. But in the 70s, home cooks had a fix. Drop in a slice of bread. Just one slice, placed into the container with the hardened sugar, would slowly release moisture and bring it back to life. Within a day or two, that brown sugar was usable again, fluffy, soft, and ready to measure. It felt like a miracle. This trick made its way through homemaker circles, recipe cards, and coffee club chats. Some swapped in apple slices or damp paper towels, but bread was the classic choice. It worked because it was simple, and it saved more than just ingredients. It saved effort. You did not need to chip away at a sugar brick or run it through a grater. Just a little patience and the wisdom passed down from someone who had seen worse pantry disasters. It was quiet kitchen knowledge, tucked between baking powder tips and pie crust repairs, and it worked. That was all that mattered. Cactus as a natural tenderizer sounds almost too strange to believe, but it was an everyday trick in many native kitchens. Certain varieties, like prickly pear, are packed with natural enzymes that break down tough muscle fibers in meat. By rubbing raw cactus slices over a piece of game meat or even marinating it in cactus juice, they could turn chewy, sinewy cuts into tender, flavorful meals that needed almost no extra cooking. It was pure kitchen magic, pulled straight from the harshest landscapes. In places where hunting was hard and every scrap of meat mattered, this trick was not just clever, it was survival. No waste, no frustration, just another example of how nature handed over its secrets to those who knew how to listen. The best part is that cactus does not mask the flavor of the meat. It simply softens it, letting the real richness shine through. Even today, modern chefs have started waking up to this forgotten genius. But it was not just fresh meals that mattered. When you needed to carry food across miles of wilderness, you needed another skill altogether: the incredible art of sun-drying meats under the open sky. Keeping lettuce crisp with damp towels was one of those quiet tricks that every grandfather seemed to know without ever needing a manual. Refrigerators with crisper drawers were not common in every household, so a simple towel soaked lightly in water became the next best thing. Lettuce heads would be wrapped gently and stored in a cool corner or ice box. The damp cloth slowed wilting, kept leaves from drying out, and added days of freshness to a vegetable that otherwise spoiled quickly. Families depended on greens for salads, sandwiches, and suppers, and wasting even one head of lettuce felt like throwing away money. The towel method stretched groceries further and kept meals looking more appetizing. A plate of limp, tired lettuce was never as welcome as one with crisp, bright leaves. This clever trick was taught in kitchens and passed quietly across generations, a testament to making do with little. Today, many people do not even think about it, but back then, a damp towel was the line between waste and dinner. Bologna salad spread was the unsung hero of thrifty sandwiches in the 70s. Housewives would grind leftover bologna, mix it with mayonnaise and pickle relish, and spread it onto white bread for an inexpensive lunch that tasted indulgent. It stretched meat further than slices ever could, making one package last several days. Children thought it was a treat, especially when tucked into lunchboxes with potato chips or carrot sticks. The spread had a tangy bite that felt different from plain lunch meat, and it became a signature flavor for many families. It was fast to prepare, easy to store, and endlessly adaptable, with some adding chopped onions or mustard for variety. In an era when waste was frowned upon, turning scraps into something craveable showed real ingenuity. Housewives understood that presentation mattered, and when cut into triangles or paired with crackers, this humble spread felt surprisingly polished. It was proof that resourcefulness could feed both bellies and pride without breaking the budget. Apple Brown. Betty was a dessert that showed just how creative poor families could be when faced with stale bread that would otherwise be tossed aside. The dish began with layers of buttered crumbs made from the old bread, placed into a baking dish alongside sliced apples and a sprinkle of sugar. Sometimes cinnamon or nutmeg was added if the spice jar still had a little left, and molasses or honey could step in when sugar was short. Once baked, the mixture turned into something warm, sweet, and comforting that felt almost luxurious compared to the daily meals of beans and bread. Kids especially loved it because it tasted like pie but was far easier and cheaper to make. Parents loved it because it stretched ingredients they already had in the pantry. The smell of apples and sugar baking in the oven made even the smallest kitchen feel rich for a little while. Apple Brown Betty was not just about feeding a family on scraps, it was about giving them a taste of joy when times were otherwise lean. For many, the memory of this simple dessert is tied to childhood and survival, proof that comfort can be baked out of almost nothing. Using mayonnaise in cakes was one of the best-kept secrets of thrifty kitchens, and food companies were not eager to promote it. The mayo replaced eggs and oil, binding and moistening the cake batter in one simple step. The result was a cake that stayed soft and flavorful, often fooling anyone who took a bite into thinking it was made with expensive ingredients. This hack was passed around in cookbooks and word-of-mouth recipes, proving itself again and again at church suppers and family birthdays. Housewives loved that one cheap jar of mayo could create desserts that rivaled bakery cakes without requiring costly extras. It was a trick that worked so well it became a guarded favorite in kitchens where thrift and pride walked hand in hand. Wilted lettuce salad was not just about saving soggy greens. It was about making the most of what the garden gave, even past its prime. When lettuce started to wilt in the heat or after a few days indoors, families did not toss it. Instead, they poured hot bacon grease mixed with vinegar over the top, reviving the leaves into something tender and flavorful. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough, and the vinegar gave it a punch of brightness. Bits of onion or crumbled bacon were added when possible, but the core of the dish was that sizzling pour. It turned tired lettuce into a warm salad with more depth than any cold dressing could offer. You did not need much to make it feel special. It was a moment when something old felt new again. In a time of extreme frugality, it captured the mindset perfectly. Do not throw it out. Just use it differently. Wilted lettuce was not a fallback. It was a quiet trick that helped people feel like they still had a choice at the table. So, this one might take you for a spin, and I'm not sure if most of you would even be familiar with the concept. Potting your butter is a pretty historical technique, but not one that's especially popular in United States history or culture. The idea this time around is to take something like a jar or a crock and store your butter in that, and then cover it with a generous layer of clarified fat. This can either be lard or the clarified fat that comes from the butter itself, but the reason for doing this is that the layer acts as a seal. It helps to keep the butter fresh, and that's because the water and milk solids from butter are removed. What you get is pure, unadulterated butterfat left. Since it is pure, it's less likely to spoil in comparison to whole butter. Protecting it from the air also does the usual routine of keeping it safe from airborne germs and microbes. People used to do this a lot because in rural areas, even when refrigeration was a thing, it hadn't become a widespread or accessible practice. In cold places, for example, the mountain ranges here, storing these pots in dark basements would help push the shelf life up even more. Packing ice boxes with sawdust may sound unusual today, but it was once a clever way to stretch the life of ice. Families without refrigerators relied on ice deliveries, and each block had to last as long as possible. Grandfathers knew that covering the ice with sawdust slowed melting and reduced waste. Sawdust acted as natural insulation, keeping the ice solid through hot summer days. Children remembered digging into piles of sawdust at ice houses where blocks were stored before delivery. The method was messy but effective, and everyone accepted it as part of daily life. An icebox lined with sawdust meant milk stayed cooler, butter did not spoil as quickly, and leftovers could be saved a little longer. It was a small adjustment that made a big difference for households trying to stretch every dollar. Sawdust was cheap, available from lumber yards, and worked better than most alternatives. It showed how practicality often outshone modern convenience in its own quiet way. Cracker crust pies were another example of how church ladies could take the simplest ingredients and make them shine. When flour or butter was scarce, they crushed saltine or graham crackers into fine crumbs and mixed them with sugar and a little fat to create pie shells. This meant no rolling pins, no dough failures, and no wasted ingredients. The crusts held firm enough to support creamy fillings like chocolate pudding or lemon custard. At potlucks, a cracker crust pie was a crowd pleaser because it tasted indulgent while still being practical. It was an affordable way to make dessert without relying on expensive ingredients that were not always on hand. The genius of it was how flexible the crust was, adapting to both sweet and tart fillings. Many women passed the trick along in church cookbooks, keeping it alive for new generations. It was not just a substitution, but a whole new tradition that carried its own charm. The simplicity of cracker crust pies is why they still appear in nostalgic kitchens today. They remind us that cleverness often comes from making do with what you have. Bread crust pizzas were the cleverest way to make use of scraps that kids normally tossed aside. Instead of throwing crusts in the bin, 70s housewives would save them up, spread tomato sauce across the surface, sprinkle a bit of shredded cheese, and bake them until golden. What might have been waste became a tray of miniature pizzas, each one bite-sized and perfectly suited for after-school snacking. Children loved the novelty of holding something that looked like a pizza but fit right in their hands, and mothers loved that nothing was wasted. It was thrifty, filling, and quick to pull together on busy afternoons. Sometimes little toppings like sliced olives, pepperoni scraps, or even leftover vegetables were added, giving the illusion of a variety platter without ever buying extra ingredients. It was a playful way to stretch one meal into another, and for many kids, these little crust pizzas were remembered more fondly than the real thing. The satisfaction of turning discarded pieces into something craved was part of the charm. Secretly sweetening tomato sauce with a sugar pinch was one of those old-school kitchen tricks Grandma probably did more times than you could count, and you never saw it coming. You would sit down to a steaming plate of spaghetti, fork in hand, and wonder how that rich, mellow sauce tasted so perfect, so balanced, with none of that sharp, bitter edge tomatoes sometimes have. The secret was a pinch of sugar, small enough not to change the flavor, but powerful enough to smooth the whole thing out. Back then, tomatoes were not always the prettiest or ripest, and canned goods could be hit or miss. But Grandma knew how to fix that. A quick toss of sugar into the simmering sauce, and suddenly, dinner tasted like it came straight from a garden patch. It was not written down anywhere. It was one of those whispered kitchen habits passed down through generations, learned by watching, never by asking. Grandmas never made a fuss over small details like that, but those quiet, clever steps turned plain ingredients into something warm, hearty, and worth gathering around the table for, one simple sugar pinch at a time. Powdered milk reconstitution with mashed potato water was the kind of trick that only a truly desperate pantry could teach you. Powdered milk was a shelf-stable lifesaver, but when the supplies started running thin, families got smart about stretching every scoop. One of the best ways was to mix it not just with water, but with the starchy water left over from boiling potatoes. That murky liquid, usually poured down the drain, suddenly had a new job, adding thickness and body to the reconstituted milk. The result was creamier and more satisfying, especially in sauces, soups, or even as a drink if you chilled it well enough. Some people even used this mixture to cook rice or oatmeal, sneaking in a little more nutrition wherever they could. It was not glamorous, but it worked. And in kitchens where every ingredient counted, it was little tricks like this that made a big difference. You were not just saving money. You were getting more from what you had, squeezing every last bit of value from the food you worked so hard to find. That kind of knowledge was passed down like gold, quietly keeping families fed when options were few. Reused pickle juice marinade might sound odd today, but back then it was a beloved trick that saved both money and flavor. When a jar of pickles was finished, the brine left behind was never poured down the drain. Instead, frugal home cooks would use it to marinate meats, soak onions, dress potato salads, or even brighten up beans. The vinegar and spices acted like an instant flavor booster, turning bland ingredients into something tangy, zippy, and unexpectedly delicious. Pickle brine also tenderized cheaper cuts of meat, making it a go-to solution for tougher steaks or leftover roast. In fact, the practice was so widespread that old cookbooks listed pickle juice right alongside salt and pepper in many recipes. Some even recommended saving different types of brine, dill, sweet, or hot, and matching them to particular dishes. It was all part of the waste-nothing attitude of the time. Even if your pantry was nearly empty, you could make dinner feel interesting again with nothing more than a splash of what was left in the pickle jar. It's proof that creativity doesn't need fancy ingredients, just a good memory, a bit of vinegar, and a whole lot of heart. Potatoes baked in foil were fine, but in the 70s, the best ones went straight on the oven rack. No wrap, no tray, just a bare potato roasting until the skin turned thick and crispy. That skin was the point. It was chewy, flavorful, and strong enough to hold sour cream or cheese. The inside stayed fluffy, but the outside had bite. It was rustic, honest, and simple. Sometimes you topped it with chili or beef stew. Other times, just margarine. Baked potatoes were cheap and filling. You could make 5 and call it dinner, but only if you baked them right. That meant no foil. Just salt, maybe oil, and a hot oven. These were not microwaved shortcuts. These were real potatoes, cooked the way your parents and their parents did it. One bite into that skin, and you understood exactly why. Browning butter for richer baked goods was a classic technique that somehow slipped through the cracks of modern shortcuts, but it transforms your baking completely. Back when recipes leaned more on simple ingredients and pantry staples, cooks had to get creative with flavor. Browning butter was one of the smartest moves they had. You would melt the butter gently on the stove until it turned golden and smelled nutty, then stir it into cookies, cakes, or muffins. The result? A rich, toasted depth that made your baked goods taste like they came from a fancy bakery, even though they used basic ingredients. This trick was buried in old cookbooks from the 50s and 60s, but somewhere along the line, we forgot it in favor of quick mixes and pre-made dough. Looking back, I cannot believe how many flat, flavorless batches of cookies I made before finally learning to brown butter. Some cookbook wisdom should never get lost. Disguising tough meat with slow-simmered onion gravy was one of those quiet survival tricks your grandma pulled off when money got tight. Back then, not every cut of meat was tender, and sometimes you had to stretch the tough stuff to feed a family. That is where the onion gravy came in. Slowly simmered, full of rich, sweet flavor, it turned cheap, chewy meat into something soft, savory, and satisfying. You would sit down thinking it was a fancy dinner, but really, it was Grandma's quiet genius working with what she had. She probably never said much about it, just stirred that pan, letting the onions caramelize, watching the gravy thicken, knowing dinner would turn out all right. Those meals stuck with you, not because they were fancy, but because they were clever, comforting, and filled with love disguised as good cooking. Breadcrumb coffee cake topping was a clever twist born from necessity and sweet tooth cravings. Butter was a luxury and store-bought streusel was a fantasy, so people turned to the one thing they had plenty of: old bread. Dried out and crumbled into coarse bits, it became the base for a topping that could rival anything from the bakery. You mixed the crumbs with sugar and leftover grease, bacon fat, lard, or even schmaltz, and scattered the mix over simple batter before baking. The result was a sweet, savory crust that crisped up beautifully and added texture to every bite. It did not melt like butter would, but it crunched and it clung to the top like a golden halo. Kids loved the crispy bits, and adults appreciated that nothing went to waste. You could season it with cinnamon or nutmeg if those were on hand, but even plain, it worked. It gave plain cakes a little flair, made breakfast feel fancy, and helped turn the most basic ingredients into something memorable. That topping was resourcefulness baked right in. Mock apple pie with Ritz crackers is the kind of recipe that sounds like a joke until you try it. This Depression-era dessert was born when apples were either too expensive or too hard to come by, but families still wanted something sweet to finish off the day. Enter the Ritz cracker, a salty, buttery, flaky little miracle that, when soaked in sugar syrup and lemon juice, somehow started to taste like baked apples. Cookbooks from the 1930s described the recipe as appleless apple pie, and you could find it in community recipe cards all the way through the 1970s. The crackers were layered inside a crust and spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. The filling baked down into a warm, sticky, and surprisingly convincing substitute for the real thing. If someone didn't tell you, you probably would never know. What made this dish so genius was how it turned an ordinary pantry staple into a dessert that felt luxurious in a time when luxuries were few and far between. People would gather around the table, pass around the pie, and pretend it was made with fresh-picked fruit from a local orchard, and honestly, most didn't mind the difference one bit. Fried bologna slices were known as a poor man's steak because they gave families a taste of meat without the cost of beef. Bologna was one of the cheapest processed meats available, and when sliced and fried in a skillet, it developed a crispy edge and savory aroma that made it feel far more indulgent than it really was. The sizzling sound and curling edges of the slices became familiar in many households where fresh cuts of meat were too expensive to afford. Served on bread with mustard or alongside potatoes, fried bologna made its way into countless meals that might otherwise have felt incomplete. Children often thought of it as a treat because it tasted so different from the usual beans or stews. Parents appreciated it for its affordability and the way it stretched across several sandwiches or suppers. Fried bologna slices represented thrift, ingenuity, and the desire to make even processed meat feel special. They were simple, practical, and deeply nostalgic for anyone who grew up on them. It was proof that a skillet and a few thin slices could turn something cheap into something memorable at the dinner table. Leftover mashed potato pancakes were a clever way to avoid waste, turning cold potatoes into something new and golden. Housewives mixed the leftovers with a little flour or egg, shaping patties and frying them until crisp on the outside and soft inside. Served with a dab of applesauce or gravy, they became a breakfast favorite that made yesterday's supper feel fresh again. This simple trick kept nothing from going to waste, proving that leftovers did not need to be boring. Families loved the texture, and children looked forward to them almost as much as the original meal. They were quick, affordable, and comforting, embodying the creativity of kitchens that made the most of every scrap. Bologna boat sandwiches were a playful invention that brought a little fun to lunchboxes and after-school snacks. Bologna was inexpensive and widely available, so moms looked for new ways to keep it interesting. By slicing a round of bologna and curving the edges, they created little cups or boats that could be filled with cheese, relish, or chopped vegetables. The result was a small, filling bite that felt more exciting than a plain sandwich. Kids loved the novelty of eating food shaped like boats, and moms appreciated that it was cheap, quick, and easy to prepare in batches. These little creations showed how 1960s moms understood the power of presentation in making ordinary ingredients feel special. They stretched lunches without adding cost and turned humble bologna into something memorable. Though they have disappeared from most tables today, they stand as a reminder that sometimes the cleverest kitchen tricks were also the simplest, making mealtimes just a bit more fun during a decade when families still gathered around the table every day. Waffle iron hash browns were the answer to crispy potatoes without the mess of frying. Shredded potatoes pressed into the iron crisped on both sides at once, freeing housewives from standing over a skillet with popping grease. It was neat, quick, and just inventive enough to feel like a brand new dish. The trick spread quickly through kitchens and community cookbooks, turning a breakfast staple into a gadget-driven shortcut. Kids loved the crisp edges, husbands appreciated the speed, and wives loved that the cleanup was minimal. It gave old waffle irons new life beyond breakfast, which was a welcome bit of resourcefulness. The result was golden, crunchy potatoes that looked just as appetizing as fried ones, but with far less fuss. A housewife in the 70s might not have had time for extra steps, but she had plenty of cleverness to spare. The waffle iron proved that appliances could double as problem solvers when you needed them most. Orange sherbet layered parfaits were the kind of dessert that looked fancier than they really were, which was exactly the point. Church ladies had a way of turning inexpensive sherbet into something that felt like a treat from a restaurant. Layered in tall glasses with whipped cream or fruit, they were colorful and refreshing. The bright orange against white cream made them eye-catching on tables lined with potluck desserts. Sherbet was cheap and kept well in the freezer, making it a practical ingredient for families on tight budgets. By layering it with simple pantry items, women created parfaits that kids loved and adults admired. The trick was all in the presentation because the flavors were simple, but the look was memorable. Parfaits like these were a favorite in summer when something cold and light was most welcome. At gatherings, trays of parfaits could be carried in and set down with pride. They proved that even with limited resources, you could bring joy and elegance to a table. They were clever, thrifty, and full of charm, just like the women who made them. Turning rendered fat into soap showed just how little was wasted in those earlier kitchens. After roasting or frying meat, the leftover fat was collected and stored until enough was gathered for soap making. Mixed with lye and water, it hardened into bars that cleaned as effectively as anything from a store. Grandfathers remembered a time when buying soap was a luxury, and this homemade version kept households supplied. The process was smelly and messy, but the end result was useful and reliable. Every bit of animal, from fat to bone, was valued for what it could provide. This trick tied together cooking and cleaning in a cycle of practicality. Even when money was tight, families could stay stocked with something essential. It was a reminder that nothing had to go to waste, not even grease. Soap made from kitchen fat was not glamorous, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. Berry-stained smoking cloths were one of the most delicate and poetic techniques in Native American cooking, blending fire, fruit, and smoke into something unforgettable. Thin cloths, sometimes made from woven plant fibers or carefully prepared hides, were soaked in mashed wild berries like blueberries, strawberries, or elderberries. Once stained with the juice, these cloths were wrapped gently around fish, meat, or even roasted roots before being suspended over smoldering fires. As the smoke rose, the berries' natural sugars would slowly caramelize, seeping into the food and layering it with a faint sweetness that tasted like summer itself. And while berry cloths offered sweetness, there was another way native chefs added rich, subtle layers of flavor to every meal. By mastering the ancient art of infusing oils with the wild herbs that surrounded them. Milk toast for sick days was as gentle as food could get. It was the go-to recovery meal when your stomach was queasy, your appetite was gone, or you just needed something soft and warm. The idea was simple. Toast a slice of plain bread, place it in a shallow bowl, and pour over warm milk, sometimes sweetened with a bit of sugar, sometimes sprinkled with cinnamon. The toast softened into something halfway between soup and cereal, easy to eat and even easier to digest. For generations, this was comfort food in its purest form, especially for children, the elderly, and anyone too worn out to chew. You would find it in vintage home nurse guides, cookbooks for invalids, and even school health manuals. It was not flashy, not flavorful, but it came with a kind of tenderness that people remembered long after they recovered. A spoonful of milk toast felt like someone tucking you in. In a world full of rich broths and fancy juices, sometimes all you needed was bread, milk, and a quiet moment to rest. Breadcrumb stuffing without meat was not just a holiday thing in the 1930s, it was a year-round filler. When families had no sausage, no giblets, and sometimes no roast at all, they would take stale bread, tear it up, and moisten it with water or broth. If you had a little onion or celery, that went in too. The whole mess got baked until crisp on top and soft inside, and it tasted like something far fancier than it was. This was depression cooking at its cleverest. The trick was to use whatever you had to stretch the meal. Sometimes the bread was barely held together with a bit of egg or flour paste. Sometimes it was just bread, salt, and hope. But it filled bellies, and that was what mattered most. People called it stuffing, even if there was nothing to stuff. It would sit in the center of the table like a roast if need be. Some families even sliced it cold the next day and fried it up like savory cake. It was warm, it was simple, and it helped people feel like they still had something special to share. That was the magic of it. Plain food pretending to be more. Cooking fish on wooden planks was an old outdoor trick that gave ordinary meals extraordinary flavor. Grandfathers would place fillets on soaked planks of cedar or oak, then set them near fire or coals. The wood steamed and smoked, infusing the fish with a rich aroma while keeping it moist. This method required no fancy pans or seasonings, just wood and patience. The result was a meal that tasted both rustic and refined, perfect for family gatherings or camp suppers. It was also practical, since the fish did not stick to pans and cleanup was easy. The technique carried a sense of tradition, passed down from native practices and embraced by homesteaders. Sharing fish cooked this way was a memorable experience, blending nature, flavor, and simplicity. Even when money was scarce, this trick made a humble catch taste like a feast. It was proof that clever cooking did not depend on gadgets, but on timeless knowledge. Rolled jam pinwheels were a sweet answer to leftover pie dough, making sure no scrap went unused in church kitchens. Instead of tossing out the extra trimmings, women rolled the dough flat, spread it with jam or jelly, sprinkled a little sugar, and baked it into spiraled cookies. The result was crisp on the outside, gooey in the center, and irresistible to anyone nearby. These little pinwheels often became a reward for children hovering around the kitchen, eager for something warm. At church events, trays of them were passed around alongside coffee, proving that even scraps could become a memorable treat. They carried with them the lesson that nothing in the kitchen should be wasted, no matter how small. Each batch was different depending on the flavor of jam on hand, which gave them a charming variety. Rolled jam pinwheels were thrift, tradition, and comfort rolled into one, a little bite of sweetness that showed off everyday cleverness. Cabbage stretching ground beef dinners was a trick that spoke directly to the frugal heart of 1960s households. When a pound of beef was not enough to feed everyone, chopped cabbage was mixed in to bulk up dishes like skillet suppers, casseroles, or even soups. The cabbage softened as it cooked, soaking up flavor from the meat and seasonings, creating a dish that tasted heartier than it really was. This approach let moms serve generous portions while keeping grocery bills under control. It also provided extra nutrition, sneaking vegetables into meals that might otherwise have been light on greens. For kids, it often went unnoticed among the sauce and beef, while parents saw it as a clever way to make a single pound of meat stretch across an entire family dinner. This simple technique became a staple of Depression-era cooking and carried proudly into the 1960s, where thrift and tradition met modern convenience. It is one of those forgotten tricks that shows how a little cabbage could make all the difference when budgets were tight. Soda biscuit revival came from the stubborn belief that no bread should go to waste, not even the dry, leftover kind. Day-old soda biscuits, too tough for the table, were split down the middle and slapped onto a hot griddle with a little bacon fat. What came off the pan looked and felt a lot like English muffins. Crisp edges, soft middles, and enough golden brown to make breakfast feel like a treat. Some families called them skillet biscuits. Others just called them what was left. You could spread jam on them, spoon gravy over them, or dunk them in coffee if you had to stretch things even further. The trick worked because soda biscuits were sturdy to begin with. They held their shape under heat and absorbed flavor like a sponge. You did not need much else, just a pan, some grease, and a little time. In a world where flour had to stretch and baking had to count, finding a second life for yesterday's bread was a quiet victory. Sneaking vinegar into poached egg water for perfect shape was one of those old kitchen tricks Grandma never announced, but you sure noticed the results. You would sit down to breakfast, slice into that perfectly poached egg, the yolk warm and runny, the white holding its neat, delicate shape, and never suspect how it happened. Turns out, a splash of vinegar in the water made all the difference. Without it, The egg whites would scatter like silk threads across the pot, turning breakfast into a mess. But Grandma knew better. A tiny pour of vinegar firmed the whites fast, keeping the egg together, tidy and ready to impress. It was never about being fancy. It was quiet confidence built from experience, knowing small details turned a meal from ordinary to special. You never saw the vinegar bottle come out, but that egg on your plate, soft and flawless, told the story loud and clear. Adding vinegar to pie crust for flakiness is one of those weird-sounding tricks from old cookbooks that actually works better than expected. Pie crust can be unforgiving, too tough, too chewy, and never quite flaky enough. But cooks in the 50s and 60s had a secret. They added a splash of vinegar to the dough. The acid helped relax the gluten, keeping the crust tender and easy to work with. It also added just enough tang to balance sweet fillings, making fruit pies, quiches, or even pot pies taste better. You would spot this tip scribbled in the margins of recipe cards or buried in vintage baking books. Honestly, I have fought with enough stubborn pie dough to wish someone had handed me this trick sooner. It is small, simple, and changes everything about your baking. If you did not have buttermilk, you made it. That was the rule, and all it took was a tablespoon of vinegar stirred into a cup of milk. Wait a few minutes, let it curdle slightly, and you had the tangy liquid you needed for pancakes, biscuits, cornbread, or whatever else the recipe called for. It was a kitchen magic trick that every home cook knew, passed down with a shrug and a smile. Just use vinegar, they would say. And they were right. The acid gave baked goods a lift. It activated the baking soda, and it added that sour flavor that made everything taste like it came from a country kitchen. Some people used lemon juice instead. Some used cream. But the vinegar trick was the most common, cheap, fast, and always reliable. It saved you a trip to the store and saved a recipe from falling flat. In kitchens where nothing went to waste and everything was done by hand, tricks like this made all the difference. It was not about cutting corners. It was about knowing the ones worth taking. Fried cornmeal mush cakes were born from the same pot twice. You would make cornmeal mush, just cornmeal, water, maybe a pinch of salt, let it set in a pan overnight, and slice it into firm pieces the next day. Then you fried those slices in grease until the edges crisped up like polenta. It was crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, and just enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something indulgent. Back in the 1930s, this was how you stretched a single meal into two. The mush might have been dinner one night and breakfast the next morning. Some people served it with syrup or molasses, while others went savory and added onions or lard. There was no right or wrong. It was all about using what was left. You did not throw anything out, especially not a whole pot of cooled mush. It became a habit, a ritual, even a comfort. Children would dunk the crispy slices in milk or eat them straight from the pan. It was Depression-era cooking at its most honest. Plain ingredients, repurposed with care, turned into something worth looking forward to. Cooking beans overnight on the stove was a practice that blended patience, thrift, and practicality in the best possible way. Dried beans were inexpensive, plentiful, and stored well, but they were tough and required long hours of cooking to become tender. To save effort, grandfathers would set heavy pots of beans on the back of the wood stove before going to bed, leaving them to simmer slowly all night. By morning, the beans had softened perfectly, absorbed seasonings, and were ready to feed the entire family without further fuss. This slow simmering method let the beans soak up flavors from onions, garlic, herbs, or even scraps of leftover ham bone tossed into the pot. The smell filled the kitchen by dawn, a comforting reminder that food was waiting for anyone who rose early to begin the day. Beans cooked this way stretched small budgets further, providing protein and nutrition at very low cost. They were served with bread, rice, or potatoes, and the leftovers were reheated for days. It was not glamorous food, but it was hearty and dependable, a true staple in households across America. This clever trick proved patience was often the most powerful kitchen tool. Gelatin mold leftover savor might sound like a punishment today, but back then it was a point of pride. Once gelatin became affordable and easy to prepare, People found all kinds of ways to use it, especially as a vessel to stretch meals and make use of leftovers. You had a little ham, some canned peas, a scoop of last night's macaroni salad. Mix it all into lemon or tomato gelatin and pour it into a mold. Chill, unmold, and suddenly you had a centerpiece. It was cold. It was colorful. It was the future, or so they said. These savory gelatin molds were featured everywhere from homemaker magazines to government-sponsored nutrition guides. They promised frugality, beauty, and innovation all in one jiggly dish. Housewives with limited means could make a full meal look polished and party-ready. People even had specific molds for specific meals. Rings, domes, fish shapes, you name it. It may not have always tasted great, but it looked impressive. And that counted for something. Somewhere between waste, not, and show-off, gelatin found its niche. Frozen vegetable medleys and casseroles were a staple of 1960s kitchens as moms leaned on convenience without giving up the appearance of hearty, home-cooked meals. Bags of frozen peas, carrots, and green beans were affordable, stored easily, and required no peeling or chopping, which saved precious time. When stirred into casseroles, they added both volume and color, transforming even simple dishes into something that looked plentiful. This clever trick made it easy to feed larger families without relying solely on expensive fresh produce or meat. It was also a way of adding nutrition without much effort, something every busy mom appreciated. Frozen vegetable medleys quickly became a dependable pantry item, used not only in casseroles but also in soups and skillet meals. They reflected the shift toward modern convenience foods while still carrying the values of thrift and practicality. For many, the sight of bright green peas and orange carrots peeking out from a bubbling casserole is a nostalgic memory of comfort and home. Sugar syrup jam preserves were another clever way families stretched what little they had into something that lasted. When fruit was scarce or too expensive to buy in bulk, housewives boiled what they had with more sugar syrup than actual fruit. The result was a sweet, spreadable preserve that could cover bread or biscuits, giving the illusion of abundance even when the jars were mostly syrup. Children loved it because the flavor was bold and sugary, while adults knew it meant the pantry would stay stocked longer. It was also a trick to keep fruit from spoiling, since sugar acted as a preservative, locking in flavor through the winter. This practice was not about luxury, but survival, ensuring that families could enjoy a taste of sweetness on lean days. Though it lacked the chunks of fruit most modern people expect in jam, it carried the same comfort, reminding households that ingenuity was just as important as ingredients. Cold potato salad with vinegar was a way to give new life to leftover boiled potatoes, turning them into something fresh instead of letting them go to waste. Families would slice or cube the potatoes, splash them with vinegar, and add onions or herbs if they had them. The sharpness of the vinegar balanced the starchiness of the potato, creating a side dish that felt different from the usual fare. It was cheap, quick, and did not require any new ingredients, which made it popular during the Depression and wartime years. Served cold, it was especially welcome in the summer when cooking fuel was too costly to waste on heating heavy meals. Poor households loved it because it was flexible and could be scaled up or down depending on how many potatoes were left over. It was proof that with a little creativity, even yesterday's scraps could become today's meal. Cold potato salad with vinegar showed how poor families made every bite count, turning the ordinary into something practical and memorable. One-crust vegetable pie was a budget-saving marvel hiding in plain sight. In the pages of countless Depression-era and wartime cookbooks, you'd find this clever suggestion: skip the top crust. Why? Because flour, lard, and butter were rationed, and a double crust was considered an unnecessary luxury. Instead, home cooks would pour a simple vegetable filling, often made from onions, carrots, potatoes, or cabbage, into a single pie shell and bake it until golden. These pies weren't flashy, but they were hearty, reliable, and warm. The single crust cut costs in half while still delivering the texture and comfort people craved. Occasionally, if a family had a little meat on hand, they'd chop it finely and mix it into the filling to boost the flavor and stretch it further. Cheese, if available, might go on top. But most often, it was just vegetables, a thickened sauce, and that humble base of baked dough. It was more than enough. The one-crust pie reflected the kind of frugality that didn't feel like deprivation. It felt like smart, resourceful living. For people managing rations and rising prices, it offered something surprisingly rich, the feeling that dinner was still something to look forward to. Mock ham loaf was not about fooling anyone. It was about bringing comfort when meat was a rare luxury. You would take mashed beans or lentils, stir in pork fat for richness, and add beet juice to give it that pink, ham-like color. The whole thing was shaped into a loaf, topped with a sweet glaze if you had sugar or molasses, and baked until firm around the edges. Some versions used breadcrumbs or oatmeal to bind it all together. Others included chopped onions or spices for flavor. It was salty, a little smoky, and just chewy enough to stand in for meat at the dinner table. Children would call it pink meat, even if it had no meat at all. And for families who had not seen a real ham in months, it filled a very real need. For familiarity, for warmth, and for something that felt like a meal. You sliced it thick, served it with canned vegetables or potatoes, and maybe had enough left for sandwiches the next day. It was humble food, made with care. Southern kitchens had a quiet trick for making dried beans cook faster and come out creamier. Just add a teaspoon of baking soda. It sounded like science fiction at the time, but it worked like a charm. You soaked your beans overnight, yes, but the baking soda softened the outer skin and made the simmering go quicker the next day. Pinto beans, black-eyed peas, navy beans, all of them got the same treatment. The result? Tender beans that fell apart in your mouth, not on your spoon. It was a dinner base that showed up in everything from chili to red beans and rice. The trick also helped with digestion, though people did not always talk about that part. And since dried beans were one of the most affordable proteins on the shelf, anything that made them easier was worth remembering. Families planned their meals around them, and when meat was scarce or too expensive, beans stepped up. Add a slice of cornbread or a scoop of white rice and you had something that felt complete. It was not flashy, but it fed you right. And in the 70s, that was what good food meant. Using a fork to decorate pie edges feels like one of those tiny details that does not matter. But ask anyone who grew up baking in the 1940s or 1950s, they will tell you presentation was everything. Pie crusts are humble, sure, but back then, home cooks still wanted their desserts to look like they belonged in a bakery window, even if they came from a crowded, modest kitchen. You did not need fancy cutters, fluted wheels, or expensive tools either. All it took was the back of a fork. You would press the tines gently along the edge of the pie, leaving behind those neat, ridged marks that made the whole thing look polished and handmade at the same time. It sealed the crust, kept the filling tucked in, and gave pies that picture-perfect finish for Sunday dinner or church potlucks. You would find the tips scribbled in old baking guides, passed down from grandmothers, or tucked into handwritten recipe cards. Thinking back, I cannot count how many lopsided, plain pies I served without knowing this. Turns out, the best finishing touch was already sitting in the silverware drawer all along. Keeping sugar soft with a slice of bread sounds odd now, but back then Grandma probably did it without blinking. Sugar was not always as cheap, and nothing spoiled baking plans faster than a rock-hard, clumpy pile of sugar in the canister. The fix? Quietly slipping a plain old slice of bread right into the jar. It looked like nothing special, but it worked like magic, pulling in just enough moisture to keep sugar soft, scoopable, and ready for whatever recipe came next. You would pop open the container, expecting clumps, but somehow the sugar stayed perfect, smooth, ready for coffee, cookies, or a birthday cake. You never saw the bread hiding beneath the surface, but you saw the results in every spoonful. Grandmas never explained those tiny tricks. They just made them routine, quietly stretching groceries, saving time, and making sure nothing, not even sugar, went to waste. That humble slice of bread might not have looked impressive sitting in the jar, but it kept baking, coffee, and sweet moments running smoothly in homes that knew how much every crumb counted. No-bake stovetop pies were the cheat code of Depression desserts. With ovens reserved for bread or simply not working at all, people found ways to make pie without ever lighting a flame under the crust. You would start with a filling, usually something like stewed fruit, canned peaches, or even rehydrated raisins, simmered with sugar and thickened with flour or cornstarch. Once it cooled, it got poured into a pie plate lined with a crust made from cracker crumbs or old toast ground fine and mixed with grease or lard. Then you would chill the whole thing until it set. No baking required. It was sweet, sliceable, and satisfying in a way that felt like cheating. You could flavor the filling with vanilla, cloves, or citrus zest if any was available, but most families kept it simple. The real beauty was in its speed and flexibility. One pan, one burner, one dessert that brought joy at the end of a long, tiring day. It proved that dessert did not need perfection. It just needed heart. And when the pie came out of the icebox, soft but solid, sweet but practical, it reminded people they still had something to look forward to. Homemade noodle scraps were a staple in any kitchen with a flour sack and rolling pin nearby. When families made pie crust or biscuits, leftover dough wasn't wasted. It was rolled thin, cut into strips, and left to dry on floured cloth before being dropped into broth. These noodles weren't fancy, but they were sturdy, the kind that bulked up a pot of soup when ingredients were scarce. Some added a pinch of salt or parsley, but most kept it plain. Community cookbooks offered tips for drying and storing these scraps, warning not to stack them wet. During the war, when packaged pasta was expensive or hard to find, this trick kept soups hearty and bellies full. You didn't need a pasta machine, just a knife and some practice. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. When every scrap of dough counted, these noodles helped stretch meals and keep families fed. Mock apple pie, also called Ritz cracker pie, was one of the most inventive tricks to come out of the Depression years when real apples were far too expensive for struggling families. Instead of fruit, crushed crackers were layered with sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of lemon juice to mimic the flavor and texture of apples. Once baked inside a pie crust, it fooled more than a few people into thinking it was the real thing. The trick was in how the crackers softened during baking, blending with the sugar and spice until they resembled stewed apples. Families cherished this recipe because it allowed them to serve what looked like a proper dessert without needing costly fruit. Children especially delighted in telling guests they were eating apple pie, only to reveal the secret later. It was part fun, part necessity, but it gave families pride in serving something clever that still tasted good. The mock apple pie proved that frugality could be playful as well as practical. And while it faded with time, the memory of turning simple crackers into a pie that looked and tasted like the real thing remains an enduring story of resourceful cooking. Extending coffee with chicory or roasted barley was a practice that dated back to the Depression and wartime shortages. When a can of coffee had to last weeks instead of days, housewives roasted chicory root or barley until dark, grinding it and mixing it with regular coffee grounds. The result was a brew that looked and smelled like coffee, though it carried a slightly bitter or nutty edge. For families used to hardship, this was a small sacrifice to keep the ritual alive. Since morning coffee was more than a drink, it was a comfort. Children grew up remembering that flavor, not realizing it was part substitution and part survival. For many, this habit stayed long after times improved, a reminder of what ingenuity could achieve. Cottage cheese with fruit as dessert was a reflection of both thrift and the health craze that swept through the 1960s. Cottage cheese was inexpensive, high in protein, and versatile, making it a favorite for moms who wanted nutritious yet budget-friendly meals. Pairing it with canned peaches, pineapple, or fresh berries turned it into a dish that looked and tasted like dessert without the cost of cakes or pies. Kids enjoyed the sweetness of the fruit, while parents felt good about serving something lighter and healthier. This trick fit perfectly into the culture of the decade, where diet foods and health trends were rising in popularity. It was quick, affordable, and practical, proving that desserts did not always have to be elaborate to be satisfying. Families remembered it fondly because it struck the right balance between indulgence and restraint, giving everyone a taste of sweetness while still keeping meals wholesome and economical. Pickle roll-ups became a surprise favorite in lunchboxes and potlucks, and they proved how far simple pantry items could be stretched. Housewives would smear cream cheese across slices of deli ham, Place a pickle in the center and roll the whole thing into a tidy bundle. Once sliced into bite-sized pieces, they looked almost gourmet, despite being assembled in minutes. Children loved pulling them apart in lunchboxes, while adults popped them like appetizers at neighborhood gatherings. They offered a crunchy, tangy bite wrapped in something hearty enough to pass for indulgence. Cream cheese smoothed out the saltiness, while the pickle added both flavor and texture, making it a clever balance of taste on a budget. It was proof that fun presentation could make even the simplest ingredients feel party-worthy. A few slices of ham, a jar of pickles, and some cheese created a dish that stood out on any table. Using starch water for ironing was a thrifty household trick that showed nothing went to waste. After boiling potatoes or rice, the leftover water was saved instead of poured away. Grandfathers and grandmothers alike knew that this starchy liquid could be brushed, sprinkled, or sprayed onto clothes before ironing. It stiffened fabric, smoothed wrinkles, and gave shirts or linens a crisp finish that looked sharp without spending extra money. This was long before spray starch bottles lined grocery shelves, and it worked just as well. The trick was simple, effective, and completely free, making it part of weekly routines in households across America. Families appreciated the polish it brought, especially when appearances mattered at school, in church, or at the workplace. It was one of those quiet lessons in resourcefulness, showing children that clever thinking stretched what little a household had. A pot of boiled rice might feed the family, and its water could keep clothes presentable too. Clever tricks like this proved that nothing in the kitchen was ever truly wasted, and that every byproduct had another purpose. Sour milk biscuits were what happened when nothing could go to waste, not even spoiled milk. In the 1930s, refrigeration was rare and expensive, so milk often turned sour before it could all be used. But instead of tossing it, home cooks put it to work. The acid in the sour milk reacted with baking soda, creating lift and softness in biscuit dough. No need for eggs, no need for fresh buttermilk. You just mixed flour, fat, soda, and that slightly sour milk into a sticky dough and dropped it onto a hot baking sheet. The result was a light, tender biscuit with a subtle tang. Some families added herbs or sugar, depending on what they had. Others used bacon grease instead of butter or skipped salt altogether. These biscuits were eaten with molasses, honey, gravy, or just plain. They were fast, filling, and above all, forgiving. If the milk was on the edge of turning but not gone completely, it was a perfect fit. Sour milk biscuits were one of those practical tricks passed from mother to daughter, a quiet way of making sure nothing got thrown out before it gave all it had. Saltine cracker pie crust was the quiet hero of the no-frills American dessert scene. Before graham crackers took over, home bakers turned to what they had: plain old saltines. Crushed up, mixed with sugar and melted margarine, and pressed into a pie dish, these humble crackers transformed into a sturdy, slightly salty base that balanced sweet fillings beautifully. You would find this crust holding up lemon chiffon pies, coconut cream, and even banana pudding. The salt gave it a surprising edge, cutting through all the sugar and keeping things from tasting one note. Sometimes cooks would toast it in the oven before adding the filling, just to give it extra crunch. And while it never became a household staple like graham cracker crusts, it held on as a clever trick among thrifty bakers. If your pantry was low and your guests were coming soon, this crust saved the day. It tasted like ingenuity, like making dessert work even when you were one step from out of options. That was the kind of creativity that turned crackers into cornerstones. Honey preservation is basically one of the few bounties of nature that will almost never betray you. It's good for your skin. It helps to boost your gut health. It doesn't ever go bad. And now I'm going to tell you all about how it preserves itself better than anything else. So, the thing with honey is that the super low moisture content in honey basically makes it impossible for any of the icky and nasty stuff we've gone over so far to grow or even get a chance to come into existence. Honey's also really acidic, and it falls anywhere between 3.2 and 4.5 on the pH scale. This helps to curb stomp the growth of any gross bacteria and fungi, so it's got a natural preservative quality in that. Anything that's got a strong acidic background naturally will do that. But honey works better for a few other reasons, like how honey naturally exudes something called glucose oxidase. When you combine this with just glucose, or sugar, you get hydrogen peroxide. This is a natural microbe hunter, and it basically destroys bacteria on site. Honey has a high sugar content already and is largely made up entirely of glucose and fructose, so go figure. Long story short, the thing is just built different and built strong. Bologna salad spread was the definition of turning scraps into something special. Church ladies would grind bologna with pickles and mayonnaise, mixing it into a creamy, tangy spread that could be slathered onto white bread. It was cheap, quick, and filling, making it perfect for lunches and socials. What might have been dismissed as a lowly meat became the star of the table when served this way. The spread had a zesty kick that paired well with crackers too, making it a versatile dish for gatherings. Families appreciated it because it stretched a small amount of meat into sandwiches for a whole group. At church events, trays of bologna sandwiches wrapped in wax paper were often passed around, vanishing quickly. Children especially loved them, not knowing the spread was born from thrift. It became part of community cookbooks and was remembered fondly as a taste of simpler times. Bologna salad spread proved that resourcefulness and flavor could go hand in hand. It was not about luxury, but about making the most of what you had and sharing it generously. Cool Whip desserts were another revelation of the 1960s, offering moms a way to create no-bake sweets that felt indulgent but required almost no effort. The frozen whipped topping could be folded into puddings, layered with fruit, or spread over pies to create airy, creamy desserts. It was inexpensive, kept well in the freezer, and opened the door to countless variations, making it an instant hit in households across America. Kids loved the light sweetness, while adults admired the ease of preparation. Cool Whip allowed families to have dessert on ordinary weeknights without the time or cost of elaborate baking. It became one of those clever staples that defined the decade, bridging the gap between modern convenience and the timeless desire for something sweet. Its versatility made it an essential tool in 1960s kitchens, ensuring that no family gathering lacked a touch of sweetness. Frozen orange juice cakes delivered brightness to even the simplest gatherings. Housewives discovered that concentrated frozen orange juice added zing to pound cakes, icings, and glazes, creating desserts that felt fresh without relying on costly produce. A spoonful of concentrate packed more punch than squeezing oranges, and it kept well in the freezer. Pound cakes livened up with orange zest became a crowd pleaser at potlucks and coffee hours. It was a shortcut that elevated simple baking into something memorable, proving that a small trick could carry big impact. Housewives cherished recipes that turned pantry staples into desserts that wowed guests, and this was one of the best. Vegetable pie with mashed potato crust was a comforting dish that made the most of humble ingredients. Instead of a flour-based pastry crust, which needed butter or lard, home cooks used leftover mashed potatoes as the top layer. Underneath was a mix of chopped onions, carrots, canned peas, or whatever vegetables were available. The mashed potatoes sealed it all in, forming a golden, crisp top once baked. This saved on rationed fats and gave leftovers a new purpose. Some cooks added cheese or poured in gravy if they had it, but even the simplest version felt satisfying. Recipes like this were especially popular in the 1940s, when meat was scarce and victory gardens were thriving. It was warm, filling, and frugal, everything a wartime dinner needed to be. More than that, it offered a sense of normalcy during uncertain times. Reheating bread in a damp paper bag for freshness is one of those little kitchen secrets tucked away in dusty cookbooks that honestly feels like magic when you try it. Stale bread was a fact of life for families back then. Bakeries were not always close, and groceries did not stay fresh as long. But folks knew a clever fix. You would take your day-old loaf, wrap it in a damp paper bag, and pop it in the oven for a few minutes. The steam softened the crust, warmed the inside, and brought the bread back to life like it had just come from the oven. It worked on rolls, buns, even dinner loaves when payday was still far away. This was the kind of trick that saved sandwiches, soups, and family dinners more times than people probably admitted. I wish I had stumbled on this sooner, thinking of how many rock-hard baguettes and stale rolls I tossed out that could have been saved with one old cookbook tip. Sweet potato pie without eggs was a testament to how much flavor could be pulled from so little. Eggs were expensive, milk was scarce, and sugar had to be stretched, but sweet potatoes were dependable. You could bake them, mash them, and mix them with a bit of flour, spices, and molasses to create a smooth filling that held together without help. The crust was optional, and in many homes it was skipped entirely to save flour and fat. The pie was poured into a greased tin and baked until it firmed at the edges and browned just slightly on top. It was soft, earthy, and just sweet enough to count as dessert. Sometimes people would add a dab of butter or a splash of vinegar to deepen the flavor. You did not need whipped cream or toppings. This was comfort on its own. It tasted like autumn, like Sunday dinner, like something you made from scratch and with care. Sweet potato pie was not about presentation. It was about getting a little joy out of the root vegetables you had on hand. And back then, that joy meant everything. Oven-dried breadcrumb savor was less of a recipe and more of a way of life. Any time you had bread that went stale, and back then, that was often, you dried it out in the oven, crushed it by hand, and stored it for later. Nothing got tossed. These homemade crumbs were used for coating fish, thickening soups, binding meatloaf, and topping baked casseroles. A batch could last weeks if you kept it dry and cool. Some people seasoned them with herbs or garlic powder, while others kept them plain and let the dish carry the flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 1950s listed breadcrumbs as an everyday ingredient, not something you bought at the store. They called them pantry gold and treated them with care. It was a small step toward stretching every meal and making use of everything, and it came with that quiet pride of not letting good food go to waste. These crumbs had a texture you could not get from store-bought. More rustic, more honest. They turned the ordinary into something that felt home-cooked and personal. Salt harvesting from natural licks and how it changed food forever is one of those hidden stories that shaped survival more than we realize. In a world without grocery stores or factories, finding salt meant everything. Native American communities knew where the land bled salt. Places where groundwater left behind crystals, or wild animals led the way to salt licks hidden deep in forests and valleys. They would collect the precious mineral by hand, scraping or boiling it out of muddy springs, then carefully drying and storing it for trade, cooking, and medicine. Salt preserved meats, flavored stews, and replenished bodies worn down by long journeys or brutal seasons. It was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. But salt was not the only way native chefs elevated their meals. When it came to pure, haunting flavor, they had another secret weapon. The living aroma of the woods themselves turned into smoke and magic. Making vinegar from apple scraps was an old and clever trick that turned what others considered waste into something valuable and lasting. After peeling or coring apples for pies, preserves, or snacks, grandfathers and grandmothers would gather the scraps into jars or crocks, cover them with water and sugar, and leave them to ferment naturally. Over time, wild yeasts transformed the mixture into tangy homemade cider vinegar. It required no special tools, only patience and an understanding that nature would do most of the work. Families stored these crocks in pantries or cellars where they aged until ready to use. The vinegar was versatile. It added flavor to sauces and marinades, tenderized tougher cuts of meat, preserved vegetables through pickling, and even served as a cleaner around the house. In lean years, making vinegar at home saved valuable money since store-bought versions were unnecessary. It also offered a sense of independence, knowing every part of the apple had a purpose and nothing went to waste. This practice was more than just thrifty, it was a proud example of resourcefulness and creativity. Homemade vinegar stood as proof that clever living turned scraps into sustenance and tradition. Homemade mayonnaise was one of those tricks that made church ladies feel like magicians in the kitchen. Before jars of mayonnaise were widely available, women learned to whisk oil and egg yolks together until they became a smooth, creamy spread. It was not easy because the mixture could break if handled too roughly, but when it worked, it felt like an accomplishment. Homemade mayonnaise was used in sandwiches, potato salads, and vegetable spreads, bringing a fresh richness that people remembered fondly. It was also far cheaper than buying prepared versions, which made it a smart choice for large families or community meals. Church ladies often passed down tips on how to get the texture right, and recipes appeared in local cookbooks to guide beginners. The flavor was sharper and fresher than store-bought, which gave simple dishes an extra kick. At potlucks, someone always had a mayonnaise-based salad that was proudly made from scratch. It was another reminder that thrift and taste did not have to be separate. Making something out of simple pantry items and skill was a badge of honor. It was clever, frugal, and satisfying. Crisping fried chicken with cornstarch and flour mix was one of those quiet little secrets Grandma tucked into every Sunday dinner. You would hear the sizzle, smell that golden crust frying, and bite into the crisp, airy coating, wondering how it always turned out perfect. The answer? A scoop of cornstarch, blended with the flour, hidden in plain sight. It was not fancy, but it worked, making the crust light, shatteringly crisp without weighing down the chicken or turning it greasy. Back then, store-bought mixes and fancy breading were not an option, but grandmas knew how to make meals special with simple pantry tricks. That little bit of cornstarch turned ordinary chicken into something that rivaled any restaurant, all while keeping budgets low and bellies full. You never saw her do it. You just tasted the difference, one crunchy, satisfying bite at a time. Thickening gravy with crushed potato flakes sounds like one of those odd pantry hacks, but if you crack open enough old cookbooks, you will find they swore by it, and for good reason. Back then, flour and cornstarch were not always easy to come by, especially if money was tight or the stores were bare. But instant mashed potato flakes? They were shelf-stable, cheap, and sitting in nearly every pantry across the country by the 1960s. All you had to do was stir a spoonful into thin gravy, soups, or stews, and suddenly the whole pot thickened right up without the clumps or gloopy texture you get when flour is rushed. Plus, the flakes added this mild, hearty taste that made the meal feel even more filling, which counted for a lot when groceries were stretched thin. It was the kind of trick that showed up scribbled on index cards or printed in those little community cookbooks every neighborhood seemed to have. Thinking back on all the runny gravies I tried to fix with panic and cornstarch, I cannot believe how long I went without knowing this one simple shortcut. Sometimes, the smartest tips really were hiding in plain sight. Raw onions can bite back. But in the 70s, if you wanted to tame that bite, especially for sandwiches or potato salad, you soaked them in salt water. A quick soak, 10 to 15 minutes, was enough to mellow their sharpness and make them more palatable. They still had crunch, they still had flavor, but the harsh edge softened, and the onion became a background note instead of the star of the show. This trick was especially common in picnic foods and summer dishes. Anything that needed raw onions but not too much kick. Cooks would slice them thin, drop them in a bowl of cold salted water, and let them rest while prepping the rest of the meal. By the time you were ready to serve, the onions were mild, sweet, and ready to blend in. It was not a showy trick, but it was one that stuck around, quietly making meals better with no extra cost. Some things you learn from cookbooks, others you learn by watching someone do it once and then never forgetting it. Wilted lettuce salad was a dish born from scraps and thrift, yet it carried a surprising richness thanks to one key ingredient: bacon grease. When lettuce leaves and onions began to wilt and lose their crispness, they would normally be destined for the compost heap, but frugal families found a way to revive them. Hot bacon drippings poured directly over the greens softened them further, creating a warm, hearty salad that carried the smoky flavor of meat even when little or none was present in the meal. It was quick, practical, and delicious, especially when paired with a slice of bread or some leftover potatoes. This trick turned otherwise wasted vegetables into a centerpiece that felt indulgent in its own way. Families loved it because it brought together two important frugal lessons: never waste food and always reuse fat. Wilted lettuce salad became a way to turn decline into comfort, reminding everyone at the table that nothing in the kitchen had to go unused. It was proof that poor families not only survived on scraps, but could transform them into dishes that still carried flavor, warmth, and satisfaction, even when the cupboards were almost bare. Orange Julius copycats were the mall treat that made its way into every thrifty household blender. Housewives learned that a can of frozen orange juice concentrate, blended with milk, sugar, and sometimes a splash of vanilla, created the same frothy drink without the trip downtown. Children begged for them after school, husbands enjoyed them on hot afternoons, and neighbors saw them as proof that homemakers could replicate anything. The mixture was creamy, sweet, and refreshing, a little luxury that cost only pennies per serving. It was thick enough to pass for indulgent, but still light enough to feel wholesome, which fit perfectly with the health-conscious trends of the decade. Housewives clipped variations of the recipe from magazines and passed them around at church gatherings, each one swearing hers tasted just like the real thing. The magic was not just in the flavor, but in the feeling of beating the system, of making store-bought luxury at home. Boiled bread dumplings were a Depression lifesaver when meat was gone and vegetables were thin. Families took stale bread, ends or crusts, and soaked them in water or milk until soft. Then they added flour, maybe an egg, and salt or onion. This got rolled into dumplings and boiled until firm. They soaked up broth and stretched soups into meals that could feed 5 instead of 2. The texture was dense, like a sponge that clung to every drop of flavor. Sometimes they were served with just gravy or fat drippings. They were not pretty, but they filled you up and gave the illusion of plenty. And in a time when illusions were all you had, that meant something. Bread dumplings turned trash into dinner, and that was enough. Cornflake coating for fried foods was one of those budget miracles that came out of a box. When breadcrumbs were scarce or you just wanted something different, people turned to cornflakes, those same flakes they poured in a bowl for breakfast each morning. Crushed into fine crumbs and tossed with a little salt or paprika, cornflakes made a crunchy, golden coating that worked on everything from chicken to pork chops to fish sticks. You did not need a deep fryer either, just a baking tray, a little oil, and a hot oven. Some versions used a milk and egg wash first, while others went straight from the cornflake crumbs to the pan. The coating crisped up quickly and stayed put, giving each bite a satisfying crunch. This trick was especially common in the 1950s and 1960s, when convenience met creativity and boxed cereals found their way into more than just the breakfast table. Kids loved it, adults called it clever, and it quietly became one of the best shortcuts in the American kitchen. Even gluten-free folks today still swear by it. The box said breakfast, but old cookbooks knew better. Lye curing your fish has been the alkaline all-rounder for all your fish preservation-related needs for centuries. This traditional preservation method takes full advantage of lye and shows you just how much of an MVP it really is. This process actually goes back to the very early times of Asian cultures, and the reason behind how this works is pretty interesting. Lye as an alkaline solution raises the pH level of a fish by like 2-folds, and this would typically look like the fish being treated in a diluted solution of lye that's been mixed with water and salt. Basically, fish has a lot of protein in it, which, is no surprise, right? What you might not know is that the alkalinity of lye disrupts that protein and makes it a lot more resistant to spoilage. It changes the whole structure, so now you don't just have protein, you have Protein Pro. Get it? I'll see myself out. Anyway, it doesn't just do those enhancements. It also boosts your catch of the day's resistance to those filthy microbes that keep popping up every 2 minutes. Pretty neat, right? What follows are 100 of those cooking tricks, pulled straight from old cookbooks, and nearly every one of them still works. 100 cooking tricks that time almost buried, and you just heard every single one. Each came from a real kitchen, tested by hands that could not afford to waste a thing. If any of these reminded you of someone, your mother, your grandmother, or a neighbor who always had the best cornbread on the block, leave their name in the comments. Subscribe so you never miss what the old cookbooks still have to teach us. Thank you for staying all the way through.